Well, hello. It is 12:45 and the meeting will now come to order. Good afternoon and welcome to our second virtual regional meeting. I'm Dr. Terry Tiersky and I am president of the Chicago Dental Society. Before we get to our speaker today, we will begin with the business portion of our meeting. We'll start with the approval of the minutes of the previous regional meetings. The official minutes of the meeting of Wednesday, September 23rd, 2020 have not yet been published, and so I will forego the reading and approving of the minutes at this time until everyone has had an opportunity to review them. There have been no reports of the Board of Directors or standing committees. There are no special reports of special committees, and there is no unfinished business to report today. We do have some new business, however. The first item of new business is proposed modification to the CDS Constitution and bylaws. The proposed modification to the CDS Constitution and bylaws was published in the September-October 2020 issue of the CDS Review, as well as published on the CDS website in accordance with Article 24 of the CDS bylaws, and requires a 2/3 affirmative vote of the active members present here today. I will now read the proposed modification to Article 12 of the bylaws, non-elected officials, Section 3, new dentist board meeting. The Board of Directors shall approve the appointment of a new dentist, a CDS member under the age of 40, to serve on the CDS Board of Directors for a 1-year term. The new dentist would be a non-voting member of the board and could receive an honoraria per diem in an amount to be determined by the board during the annual budgeting process. Duties and responsibilities will be defined by the Board of Directors and outlined in the policy manual of the Chicago Dental Society. If there is any objection, please indicate by using the raise hand tool located on your screen. Seeing no objection, the proposed modification to Article 12 of the bylaws, non-elected officials, Section 3, new dentist board member, passes. Thank you. Item number 2. Oh, hold on. We had 3 raised hands, but it still passes. Thank you. Item number 2 is the 2021 CDS officer nominations. It is my pleasure to report that the nominating petitions for the 2021 officers have been duly filed in the CDS Central Office and their names duly published in the May, June, July, August, and September, October 2020 issues of the CDS Review, as well as in the digital version of the review, in accordance with our bylaws. The following members have been nominated for office to represent the Chicago Dental Society for 2021. For President-elect, Thomas F. Schneider, Jr. For Secretary, Michael G. Durbin. For Vice President, David B. Lewis, Jr. And for Treasurer, Denise D. Hale. Since not more than one candidate has been nominated, I will entertain a motion to direct the Secretary to cast a single unanimous ballot on behalf of all of the respective candidates for office. If there is any objection, please indicate by using the raise hand tool located on your screen. Seeing no objection, the motion carries. And I want to thank all of you and give my sincere congratulations to Denise Hale, Treasurer-elect, Dave Lewis, Vice President-elect, Mike Durbin, Secretary-elect, and Tom Schneider, President-elect. These officers will be installed on Sunday, November the 8th, 2020, along with Dr. Dean P. Nicholas, who will assume the office of CDS President. These officers will assume their respective duties on January 1st, 2021, and will continue through December 31st, 2021, in accordance with the fiscal year. I would like to at this time extend an open invitation to all of you to join us via Zoom on the occasion of the installation of officers. With health and safety as a top priority, We believe this is in the best interest of our members and their extended families and practices. CDS members and their families and staff can join us for this important celebration and welcome the new 2021 officers and branch directors to their positions. The ceremony will be presented on Zoom, and then you can obtain additional details and a meeting Zoom link that will be distributed closer to the event online at cds.org as well as by email. We look forward to all of you being a part of this ceremony on November the 8th. All right, I have a couple of very important announcements. The first one is, if you haven't already heard, the CDS 2021 Midwinter meeting is going virtual. That meeting, Heart of Dentistry, will be held live Thursday, February 25th through Saturday, February 27th, 2021. Attendees of the 156th Midwinter meeting will be able to participate virtually in scientific programs as well as exhibits, with access to renowned clinicians and leaders in dental innovation, just as we've always offered to you, on a variety of topics geared for all members of the dental team. This virtual platform will allow our attendees to quickly and efficiently navigate between interactive exhibitor booths, to explore new products, speak with company representatives, and network and engage with colleagues. So please be a part of this. Registration will begin on November 2nd, which is next week. Now, as a reminder, 2021 is a CE reporting year for Illinois. So be sure to make plans to attend this groundbreaking event, and so that you stay up to date on your CE credits. You will be able to access this site through March 15th, 2021. So the on-demand sessions will be available from March 5th through March 15th, 2021. You'll still be able to visit the exhibits, you'll still be able to register your team and purchase additional courses for on-demand education hours. So again, don't forget, registration begins on Monday, November the 2nd. Second announcement, if you've not already done so, don't forget to opt in for text messaging. In order to receive text messages, you have to opt in. You can find out the information on our website, but since you are here with us today, I can give you the inside scoop. What you need to do is text dental in all caps, DENTAL, to 69922. That's text dental to 69922, and you will then receive text messages from the Chicago Dental Society. Okay, I'm happy to say that today's program is being co-sponsored by Crest Oral-B. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Marina Smoloff from Crest Oral-B, who would like to say a few words to you. Marina?
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on your call today. I have a little commercial for you guys on our newest technology that we have with Crest and Oral-B. I'm happy to introduce you guys to the new Oral-B IO. Not sure if a lot of you guys have tried it. I'm sure some have and some haven't, but for those that have not yet, this is brand new power brush from Oral-B. It's an electric rechargeable brush that has been re-engineered inside and out. Next slide, please. Many of you guys know that I am your territory manager in Chicago North Territory. My name is Marina Smoloff. So please feel free to reach out to me. This is my phone number and my email. And I will be happy to do a lunch and learn for you guys on the new brush, or come in to show you in person, or even do a Zoom or a WebEx meeting. But before we get into the pricing of the brush and all that good stuff, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the brush. Next slide. So as you guys know, electric rechargeable is a performance-driven category. The more we improve the performance, the higher the efficacy, and ultimately deliver better patient outcomes as a result. As good as Genius Brush is and other brands in the marketplace, there's always an opportunity to improve the entire brushing experience. And then what we want to do is to move from the aesthetics of the tool that cleans teeth to literally an image of a beautiful, smart object the person wants to possess. And I think we've done exactly that with this new brush. If It's these truths that guided us along with the advancements we've made in technology that allowed us to bring you the new Oral-B IO. And as you might expect, as we developed the brush, we asked dental professionals and their patients all over the world to try it. And despite the differences in cultures and languages, there seemed to be one common word that described their brushing experience with the Oral-B IO. Next slide. And that is the word wow. This is truly a brushing experience unlike anything else. The Oral-B IO brush is absolutely quiet. So for those of you guys that have used the Genius brush in the past, it is extremely effective and does a great job, but a few dental professionals have complained that it is loud. So this brush uses magnets instead of gears. So you have an ultimately impressive brushing experience while also delivering an effective result. Next slide. So for most of you, this may be the first time you've ever seen an Oral-B IO, but we've been showing it to many people, including the folks at the ADA who have given this exciting new technology their seal of acceptance. Next slide. And we didn't get here by accident. It's actually been 6 years in the making, this brush. So this IO brush was inspired by patients and their desire to want more. We leveraged the latest technologies and harnessed them into the handle and throughout the bristles. And finally, from dental professionals like yourselves who continue to strive for better patient outcomes. Next slide. We deliver you the new IO, which is truly a different brushing experience than anything you have imagined. So I do encourage you guys to reach out to me if I am your territory rep. You have my information. I would love to come in and do a lunch and learn for you guys, or simply sit down for a quick meeting. And we also have these employee trial units available for staff special of $99. These are the new IO 9 series for $99. They come in a bundle with the brush, the paste, the floss, the rinse, 2 brush heads, that nice case, everything together for $99. So please feel free to reach out to me. And of course, they're available for the office to purchase, which is about $140 a bundle. And there's a $30 rebate with that. So yeah, I encourage you guys to look it up online. Retails for around $300. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you to Crest Oral-B for your continued support of the Chicago Dental Society. Crest Oral-B is generously offered to raffle off 4 Genius X electric rechargeable brushes today. And while Marina was giving her presentation, we randomly selected 4 names, and I'm going to read the 4 names of those that have won the toothbrushes. They are Andy Brower, Michelle Monteith, Sarah Ruse, and Stephen Facco. So congratulations to all of you, and you will be shipped from Crest Oral-B your gifts. All right, so it is now my pleasure to call upon Regional Meeting Program Chairman, Dr. Jim Frett, who will provide information and a few housekeeping items on today's webinar before introducing today's speaker. Thank you to all, and go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Terry. Hello, before we introduce today's speaker, this program is a webinar. Your microphone and camera are not available. During the presentation, you are encouraged to type your questions in the Q&A tool on your screen. Dr. Ted Boris, CDS Director of Scientific Programs, will assist you with the Q&A by fielding your questions to present to the speaker. The question and answer portion will be at the conclusion of the lecture. We are privileged today to have our state-mandated opioids review presented by Ms. Karen Baker, RPH, MS. She is on the faculty of the University of Iowa, is a recognized expert in drug indications, interactions, and herbal medications. She has been a frequent contributor to Midwinter Meeting scientific programs, and in fact has agreed to be part of Midwinter 2022. It is my pleasure to introduce Karen Baker.
Thanks so much, Jim. Hi, everybody. I'm very pleased to be with you all via Zoom this afternoon for our meeting. And so I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I will be supplying the slides to you. Can you see my screen share? Let me just do this. Okay. Okay, you should have the first slide up then. I will be supplying my slides to you. I usually don't do that, but I looked at how intense all this information was, and I thought, you know, if you ever do, and I don't know if you do, but you might be locked in your house over the weekend, so you might get truly desperate and say, you know, I want to look at that article that she talked about on Wednesday. And so I feel as if I need to supply this to you. So Angela has already posted for you the handout on pain management. It's about 8 pages, but I'll post a few other things too. But among those, just posting the slides was too big, so I'm going to try to retrofit those, but I will give you the slides, which as I say, I usually don't do. And then you also right now do have a handout if you want to look at that, but I would just encourage you to just sort of relax and take a look at what we talk about here today. And then I know, Ted, you're going to be the moderator for the questions. I see the chat room lighting up, but I assume that you're managing that. So I will go ahead and I'm going to have a little laser pointer light on like that. Try not to be annoying with it. And I know many of you might be zoomed out, so I'm going to try to make this, I'm going to start off with a little levity here. Don't misunderstand, I certainly take the COVID crisis seriously, but I think we're also sort of nearing having had enough and kind of just want to be done. When you can start seeing these two merge, I think we want to be done. I think that I had a pretty good clue that maybe 2020 wasn't going to be great because, you know, there was a viral bushfire. Now, what is that all about in Australia? Then a film called Parasite won for Best Picture. I didn't know you could leave your family. And so Harry and Meghan resigned from their family. And I think that might be a precedent that a few others would want to investigate. But apparently that is something that can happen. It looks like okay. I assume that you're still seeing it. I don't know quite what happened there, but I'm going to do it again and slide share. I'm just going to go ahead and end and reshare. How about that?
Yes.
Okay. Not sure why I can't. Here we are. Do you see that now?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Not sure why that's happening. Okay. So there's your, there's Harry and Meghan. And then we had the hornets, or the swarms of hornets. And I saw that they just managed to put on their PPE in Seattle and go out and take care of that. The murder hornets. And just so you know, there is like murder hornet hand sanitizer. So that's something that's happened. So I think we're all done. I am personally I'm struggling because there's this Karen phenomenon where people aren't wanting to name their little girl's Karen, and this is apparently the prototypical Karen. We also have all kinds of things like the COVID handshake alternative, a variety of creative mask options for you. But I think most telling of all is what happened in the lockdown. And I know you had a shelter in place, I know in Chicago for a while. And this is the kind of deterioration that can happen as you see, some of it very sad, especially the Hemsworth transformation here is just really not to be borne. One of my favorites, Helen Mirren, and then of course Ryan Reynolds, who's now stuck in his basement hiding from his mother-in-law. So we have new language that has begun because of coronavirus, COVIDiots, quarantini, coronials, doom surfing, and doom porn are two terms that I've never heard before. This was our Costco down here in the lower right-hand corner. So after the initial meatpacking plant shut down, my favorite Barefoot Contessa, somebody should probably check on her. She used a whole bottle of Grey Goose to make this Cosmopolitan and then proceeded to drink it out of a giant glass. So most of us do this kind of thing, but we don't put it on the internet. So that's something that's a bit disconcerting. We have doom surfing, doom scrolling, Zoom bombing, and you aren't probably surprised since we're on Zoom today to see that Zoom communications is worth more than the 7 top airlines. So that was a rather rapid transformation. One thing I do want to just say to try to put things in a bit of perspective for everyone, this is from a website called The Visual Capitalist. And if you ever need images, and I always make attribution obviously, but they do a nice job of putting things in visual format. And I thought you'd want to see the human condition and the history of pandemics. So when we go up here, we have the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Justinian. I remember Justinian, you know, he was a good emperor. I've been around a while. But then we have the Black Death, almost took out humanity there, 1347. Smallpox, which I think we hardly think about these days. Then on progressing into close to present times, we have HIV, AIDS, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu. And then I wanted to show you, this was September 29th, so it's gone up a bit. This is worldwide, it's more than that now, but that's worldwide deaths compared to, let's say, HIV, AIDS, 81 to present, 81 to present, sorry. And HIV, AIDS, even though there is no vaccination, there is effective combination therapy. So here we have the death toll starting from the most deadly to the least deadly, which was the SARS, which is a COVID-like virus in the same family in 2002 and 3. But because of the communicability of COVID, that's where we are with COVID. So I just want to put all of that in some sort of perspective. Going to Costco is sort of an I am legend kind of a thing. You can't take your German Shepherd in there, but for a while it was pretty challenging. So just sort of maybe a little bit of a lighthearted view. I realize dentistry has been impacted very, very significantly. We here at the College of Dentistry in Iowa City went from, seeing 500 patients a day to 0, and then to emergencies only for a while. We did have our oral surgeons start back up, I believe, May 18th, and we have been fairly operational with the student clinics since all the students came back. They left after spring break. I, of course, on March 11th was in New York City because I'm thinking, where's the hot spot? It was in New Rochelle at the time, and I did actually likely contract COVID, but I had a very mild case. So it's widely variable. And I'm sure everybody has their own stories and has been touched in many, many ways. So again, I think hopefully we are looking at vaccines in early 2021, first half of 2021. They're going to be a 2-injection series, and that along with therapeutics will get us back to something resembling normal. So with that, let's go ahead and address some of the major topics. What I thought I would do is take, and I emailed this to Ted yesterday. I thought I'd take a break maybe halfway through so you could go up and mix a soft drink or whatever Ina Garten is mixing, and then come back and we'll finish up, and then we'll leave time at the end for questions, and we'll be done and wrap up by 4 o'clock. So we have a lot of slides, and as I said, I think what I'll try to do is make you something that you can use chairside that you've got. I think Angela posted for you a chairside handout on pain that's already on the CDS website under regional meetings. So here's what we're going to try to do this afternoon in the 2.5 hours that we have. I think we're going to try to start talking about the extent of the problem in the U.S. and the drugs involved. And I think that we're very well aware of this. Nobody has looked at COVID-related opioid deaths yet. So I think that that's something that we just don't have the data on. Dentistry's role in fueling the current opioid epidemic, I think to a large extent, it's been overblown in terms of what the true impact of dental prescribing of opiates is, but I will talk about how we can try to figure that out. Then what acute opioid guidelines should dentists rely on? Do we have any acute opioid guidelines? None from the CDC, by the way. Has the CDC published any guidance for acute? They have some patient handouts. If you go to cdc.gov/opioids, you can see that, but they have not published anything for acute use. They are working on that now, and it should be done soon. There is a chronic opioid prescribing CDC guideline set. We're going to try to talk a little bit, although it's a huge problem. When did this problem start and why? And I think a lot of us have a long-term perspective and can talk a bit about that, especially for the younger folks who maybe have just gotten into practice in the last 5 to 7 years. In terms of brain biology and neural effects, why are opioids so addictive? And it's been a difficult thing to look at because acute use versus chronic use is different in terms of brain pathways and chronic effects. Which patients are at elevated risk? Again, very tough, and we'll talk about some of the tools that you could possibly use, but which patients are at elevated risk of opioid substance use disorder? And that's the correct terminology, by the way. If you're wondering why I keep saying substance use disorder, why don't I just say addiction? Because as of 2017, addiction was not the appropriate terminology. The appropriate terminology is substance use disorder for whatever substance you're talking about. Shopping, gambling, substances, alcohol, heroin, fentanyl, whatever it might be, opioid substance use disorder. What are the most effective regimens for dental pain? And our new alternative approaches for dental analgesia, some of them very, very promising. Some of them have not lived up to perhaps what we hoped they would give us in terms of alternatives to opiates. And then how can we educate patients about opioid risks? When I talk about a variety of different types of prescribing issues in dentistry, I feel as if sometimes I'm spending much more time talking about how to educate your patient to prepare them for you not prescribing versus prescribing. And I'm, of course, talking about opiates and antibiotics. So, I mean, antibiotics are a different topic for a different day, but I will say that many, many patients now are very receptive to the reasoning behind avoiding opiate avoidance, especially in undeveloped brains. And who am I talking about? I'm not using that as a pejorative. An undeveloped brain is a human who's 25 and under. And of course, all of us have different developmental challenges and rates, but typically your impulse control neural pathways aren't fully developed until you're about 25. And my kids, I don't know, I'm still waiting. One's 32. She would die if she knew I was saying that. One's 32, one's 26. I'm hoping for something, but essentially the inhibitory pathways would make it less likely for you to do risky things, less likely for you to say, hey, everybody watch this, and then post it on Instagram. So there was a ADA journal publication by Moore and Hirsch, and they have really been at the forefront of helping us in dentistry to chart the path towards non-opiate pain relief in dentistry. Although I will tell you that I started here at the college in 1981. And in 1981, at the College of Dentistry, the #1 dental pain medicine was Analgesic DC. I don't know if anybody remembers that. It was a subtherapeutic toxic combo of 5 drugs in one capsule. Analgesic DC, dihydrocodeine, the only oral narcotic less effective than codeine. So that's where I started in 1981, and the work of Sunshine and Cooper that had begun in the mid-70s became prominent in 1980 through 85, and therefore we made the radical shift at that time here in our clinics, and I'm sure most of you did too, to try to abandon opiates or save them as rescue and use nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs in patients who could tolerate them. And of course, our problem is that there are patients who can't take nonsteroidals, so I'll talk about that, and that's an issue we have to face. So this was an article published in JADA, I think in November, that talked about the origins of the opioid crisis, maybe beginning with a letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine in about 1980, and it was from the Boston Drug Surveillance Project, and essentially it said in the letter, it said, we have reviewed many patients who've received narcotics inpatient, and we find that it does not predispose them to opioid substance use disorder. Opioid addiction was the term that was used at that time. And then that letter to the editor was referenced many times until pain became the 5th vital sign in the mid-90s. And the 5th vital sign was you must ask about pain when you see a patient versus doing the other 4 assessments of vital signs. And I think many of us even were aware of the fact that some state boards required dentists to take compassionate pain management course training before they could receive their DEA or their state controlled substance application number, in which you were told that pain was the 5th vital sign and it must be asked about and addressed. So things have really come full circle. In 2016, the American Medical Association said pain is not the 5th vital sign. There are 4 vital signs. So that's the full circle. The American Pain Society, a lot of money that was dumped into a variety of systems from Purdue Pharma and a variety of other folks. Purdue is the bankrupt company that brought you OxyContin and MS Contin, and it was over marketed and underestimated in terms of toxicity. Now, I will say this. I'm going to show you something in a bioethics journal, which is maybe too deep for a Wednesday afternoon, but I'll tell you, there is so much inappropriate influence and networking of money that goes into some of these decisions that it would be very hard to extract the process away from the money. So I wanted to show you something about the timeline of the opioid supply. And this is from the DEA, National Institute of Drug Abuse. And I also wanted to show you how much fentanyl it takes to kill you. Fentanyl is what is responsible for the vast uptick in overdose deaths. So what we find is that, for example, Prince, in his tragic death, took hydrocodone that was laced with fentanyl. So the quality control from illicit or diverted drugs is not reliable. And he had no idea that that's what he was doing, according to friends and family and the coroner in Hennepin County. So if you look at prescription opioids, heroin, and fentanyl, the big issue now, because we have a better handle on other things, the big issue now is fentanyl that is shipped from China. It comes through the mail. It's trafficked from Mexico over the southern border. And it does have, some of it's pure, some of it's not. It's very hard to tell what you've got. If you've got high purity, it's very lethal. If you have low purity, it isn't. So there's just a distinct lack of quality control in the fentanyl. So I thought I would show you that. I'm not going to belabor it other than to say you might be surprised to see this. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which was formed under Richard Nixon in the early 70s, sets aggregate production quotas in the United States of these drugs. And these are kilos, so that's 2,000 grams. So you could take those numbers times 2,000 to give you grams. There was this huge jump in legal quotas between 2012 and 2013, and there are probably a lot of issues there. And then doing the math, how much was legally manufactured? That's the number of milligrams that you see in the upper right, and hydrocodone was enough to supply every person in the United States with 104 of the 5 milligram tablets. So I think you've all heard the fact that the United States consumes 99.9% of the world's hydrocodone. Certainly in Europe, hydrocodone is not prescribed. It's not even available in any sort of useful dosage form in Canada, for example. So if your friends in Canada say, why do you prescribe that? We don't use that up here, A. So if you look at reductions in controlled substance quotas, things have changed radically since the slide before. You see the date here on the left-hand side is April 18th of 2018. And the aggregate quotas have been brought down and they are decreasing, as you can see here. So these are grams which you'd take, again, those previous numbers I showed you, you had to take by 2000. So really, let me just put in perspective that in 2018, look at hydrocodone, 34,800,000 grams. In 2018, it was over 100,000 grams. So it's been cut by more than 2/3. So I'm just giving you that as an estimate of what's going on in terms of legal quotas. Of course, that doesn't account for illicit or and then diversion, but the DEA is required to take diversion into account when they come up with these quotas. So a lot of things have happened to make this difficult. In Congress, we have a variety of things that have happened. As you can imagine, if you've walked down K Street, there are a lot of people in expensive clothing having very expensive lunches. And I know there are now all kinds of designer shops everywhere. Political action committees representing the drug, big pharma, the drug industry contributes a lot of money. So the question is, what's Congress doing? Congress has largely taken a public health approach. There's the Cures Act, the 21st Century Cures Act. So it's a multi-pronged approach to the opioid epidemic. In big pharma, Purdue Pharma, OxyContin no longer being marketed to practitioners. It was being marketed in a variety of very powerful ways, as was fentanyl and other drugs. originally touted as smooth and sustained and something that will keep your patient base very happy. Unfortunately, that happiness is not long-term. Increasing numbers of lawsuits, and I'll show you where we are now today. The Senate committee accuses 5 largest opioid manufacturers of spending $10 million on patient advocacy and medical groups. So, you know, the pharmaceutical industry does many, many wonderful things. If you look at what has been done to mobilize vaccine production and vaccine development for COVID, but it also needs customers. So there are about 2,020 lawsuits right now pending against drug companies and drug wholesalers. And just to give you an idea, this was just in the Wall Street Journal on the left, 21 states reject $18 billion offer. They want it to be 22 to 32 billion from drug wholesalers. Who are drug wholesalers? Those are the big 4 companies that sell prescription drugs to pharmacies and hospitals. So McKesson is one, Amerisource is one, Cardinal is one. So these are the drug wholesalers that have warehouses all around the country. And then if you see on the other side, this was just a recent report 6 days ago, actually, Purdue Pharma to plead guilty an $8 billion opioid settlement. And so all the money that was made there is now hopefully going to be plowed back into treatment. I wish I could tell you that the 30-day treatment centers are more successful, but as we're going to investigate, and I think many of you perhaps have some knowledge of success rates. Success rates are what, about 15 to 20%. So between 75 and 80% recidivism for opioid substance use disorder. It's a very, very difficult and challenging long-term problem. You can see all the dollar signs here, and the dollar signs have to do with why it started, why it continued, what drove it, and then how do we stop it. Now, dollars are one way to stop it, but I think knowledge is another way to stop it. And I know you were waiting for this very excitedly. I promised you an ethics journal. It's called Bioethical Inquiry. That's a tongue twister. And Lessons from Corporate Influence in the Opioid Epidemic Toward a Norm of Separation. So I think, and this is published in May of 2020. So what I think that you can do is, if you're interested in this issue from a political action level, there are a couple of things you can do. One is become educated about it. And I know some of you are very politically active locally, statewide, nationally. So this is a really good article by Jonathan Marks that explains, a bioethicist who explains how things have happened. You can click on the references and take a look at those. One of the good websites to see where the money goes is called opensecrets.org. And I don't know if you even want to look here. What are we, 6 days before the national presidential election? But Open Secrets tracks lobbying money that comes from pharmaceutical companies, and to whom does that go and why, and what pending legislation is influenced. So there are ways for you to become more informed about this. Unfortunately, when I type in my search engine, dental, prescribing, opioids, these are some of the images, and I click on images, these are some of the images that I get. That one in the upper left says, would you give your child heroin to remove a wisdom tooth? Where in the world is that from? That is from the New Jersey State Department of Health website. Upper right is adolescents exposed to opioids have a 33% higher risk of abusing them later in life. That sounds very alarming, and I am going to show you some data that shows that the risk appears to be much lower than that. That was one particular survey of high school students who were opioid naive, and then they were followed, but I'll talk about that a bit more. Lower left-hand corner, painkiller addiction often sets in after extensive dental work. And is that really true? I think we're going to find that it's not often true, but there is a subset of particularly susceptible people that perhaps should not be exposed at all to opiates. So I just gave the lecture yesterday on central nervous system psychiatric disorders. I have the DSM-5 on my phone. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I keep it on my phone just, for family reunions. But what I find is that there are people, there are folks you're going to recognize in terms of patients when you read some of the symptom lists for the various types of personality disorders. And up to 40% of substance use disorder patients have personality disorders. So there is a big overlap there, and something that will not surprise you if you have been in practice for a long time. And then disposal, I think we're all pretty well aware that you destroy extra opiates, but for a long time, the leftover opiates were a huge misused reservoir that was in grandma's medicine cabinet and was taken out by the 16-year-old high school football player for a party on Friday night. And that's, everywhere across the United States. It doesn't spare anybody. I've been touched by the opioid epidemic. I think probably everyone has. So the ADA certainly has stepped up and done a lot of things well. It's good that the ADA has stepped up, because otherwise other bodies that don't have benefit of a medical background or proper consideration perhaps will do things. This is an example of that. And I don't mean to single out Vermont only, but I will tell you that Vermont in 2016, because of the alarming rates of opioid overdose deaths, and they are particularly alarming in the Northeast United States, New Hampshire, Vermont. Here's what you see is the state law says you cannot prescribe. If you look total allowed, look at the third column over, you cannot prescribe any opiates for minor pain. And then they classify that as molar removal on the far right. Now they get down into maxillofacial surgery for severe pain, and they say you can give 6 hydrocodone 5 milligram tablets or 4 5 milligram oxycodone or 4 hydromorphone, which I think most dental clinicians don't ever prescribe. Hydromorphone is Dilaudid. So I just wanted to show you that, because that was a legislative reaction to a very alarming problem. The April 2018 issue of the ADA Journal was really good. There were 4 articles that talked about opioids and dentistry. So if you go back in the archives, you can look at that. When I'm looking at the issues that seem to impact dentistry most when it comes to opioids, one of them is the issue of leftover opioids. And so I think that instead of dentists have really gotten the message on that in the last 5 years, unfortunately, most of the dental prescribing data that comes from retrospective analysis of insurance claims isn't more recent than 2015, and a lot of it's from 2012. So please don't be alarmed. When you see these studies, make sure you go in and look and say, when was this data collected? Because things have changed radically from 2012 to now in terms of dental prescribing. Don't get me wrong. Believe me, dentists have always prescribed low numbers of opiate tablets, but have much more frequently prescribed opiates in the past than what is the norm now. A real firestorm happened with this JAMA Internal Medicine article that was written. I think the lead author is a pediatrician from California. This was a retrospective chart review, and you'll notice that it came from 2015. So again, this is going to be retrospective, but it looked at the key question was opioid naive young people. What is their primary exposure? It's to dental opiates. And is there a risk of substance use disorder or prolonged opioid use due to that exposure from dentists? And what the findings were that were stated here were that the real risk was, the absolute risk increase was 6.8% in persistent opioid use due to a dental exposure from opiates. So what did the authors recommend? The findings suggest that dental opioid prescriptions, which may be driven by third molar extractions in this age group, may be associated with subsequent opioid use and opioid abuse at that 6.8% absolute risk increase versus, remember that one of the first slides I showed you was 33%. So these are still big numbers, 6.8%. I will tell you that if you talk to biostatisticians about that study, there are some problems with it. But having said that, it was certainly dentists have radically reduced numbers of prescriptions, and that has been since 2015 by at least 500 million per year. So that is a lot of reduction, 500,000, excuse me, per year. So one thing I want you to see here is this is how dentists compare with other specialties in prescribing opiates. And as you look at this, this was published in 2017, but where's the data from? And that's one thing. This is from NPR. You know, you're driving along in your car and you've got that soothing voice from NPR, and then that soothing voice says something like dentists are number 4 on the opioid prescribing rate, and then you hit the bridge abutment. So no, that's just me. So if you look at how dentists stack up, and I've just made that a bit larger, you see that opioid prescriptions out of total prescriptions is what we're talking about. So what does that mean? First of all, it means that look at total prescriptions. Who prescribes the most prescriptions? Well, physicians do. So first of all, there aren't a lot of prescriptions, 64 million total in this 2012 data set. So keep that in mind. Opioid absolute numbers, if you want to really look at that, is 18.5 million. And that has dropped substantially now, although we don't have 2020 data. We have 2018 data that the American Dental Association has talked about that says that we've dropped those numbers. So I want to say part of the high percentage over here, 28.9%, is because dentists don't write a lot of prescriptions per year compared to, look at family practitioners. And in pain medicine, certainly a big percentage are pain meds, surgeons, of course, big percentage, physical medicine and rehab. And that would be, I just had a knee replacement, so that would be in that realm of treating patients with a variety of different painful rehab processes, and then dentistry. So essentially all the legislators see, all the patients here are, dentists are the 4th most common prescribers of opiates, when what this really means is what percentage of total prescriptions are opiates for dentists. That's what you're looking at here. So it's not surprising because dentistry deals with pain. And I don't think we should be too surprised by that. But having said that, the number of tablets per prescription is very low compared to the pain medicine clinic. So talk to any pharmacist and they're going to say, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, dentist, you're not the problem. The problem is the pain clinic down the street that prescribes hydromorphone 2 milligram tablets number 360 and prescribes that every month for a patient. So I think we need to look at morphine milligram equivalents to figure out extent of the problem generated by dentistry, and I'll talk about that in a minute. One of the other things that's happened is we're being compared in the US. US dentists are being compared to dentists in the UK and in Canada and other places. I will say in the United Kingdom, and what's that? That's England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. What do you get for tooth extractions? You get tramadol. The other thing about the UK is that the National Health Service stopped recommending third molar extractions in 2011. So when you think about bone removal surgeries in dentistry, what are they? The vast majority are third molar extractions, which they really don't do to any high degree in the UK and in Europe in general. So that's not mentioned by Dr. Thornhill in this article. And traditionally, they also prescribe tramadol that is not without its habituation liability. I was just reading a British Medical Journal report about the growing concern with tramadol substance use disorder in England. So this is a bit, I think, a bit misleading. And those differences, also Canada, for example, there isn't even an oral hydrocodone tablet available in a dosage form that could be used for dentistry. So in Canada, if you want to prescribe an opiate in dentistry, you either prescribe codeine, Tylenol with codeine, or you prescribe oxycodone or hydrocodone or hydromorphone. No hydrocodone, hydromorphone, excuse me. So there's no hydrocodone that's even available. So to say that dentists are dependent on hydrocodone in the United States, certainly it's the habit as our number one opiate, but there are certainly a number of reasons behind it. So I told you that the ADA had a response to that JAMA Internal Medicine article that came out December of has it been almost 2 years ago now? And the response is listed down here, that the 18.5 million prescriptions in 2012 by US dentists for opiates had reduced to 18.1 million in 2017, and hopefully we'll have some 2020 data soon. I suspect it's down radically from that. So what we need to then do is look at, again, where dentists are in the hierarchy of prescribing opiates as a percentage of their total prescription output. And I suspect you would see a radical drop in percentage from, what was it, 28.9% of prescriptions were for opiates. Think about your practice. What percentage, those of you who prescribe, in Iowa, we're all e-prescribing now. So there are some offices that just dispense 5,000 part per million sodium fluoride toothpaste out of their office and don't even have an electronic prescribing option because they just don't prescribe. They recommend over-the-counter pain relief and don't need to e-prescribe, which does cost a fee per month. And you have to have the right software. So I will say that in Iowa, I think everybody's going to have to be e-prescribing by January 1 of 2021 nationally. And that is to close the prescribing system so that there is not access to forging prescriptions. And in general, that's a good thing, but it has made it difficult for practices that don't prescribe often to serve their patients. So there always are some drawbacks of any of those kinds of mandates. Drug overdoses are mostly the opioid deaths. The radical increase in opioid deaths was mostly due to fentanyl. And I know you know about these maps. You never want to be a dark color on any of the Centers for Disease Control maps. So unfortunately, Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, you see that little swath there, and then a lot of states are higher end in the opioid-related overdose deaths, although I will show you some Illinois Department of Public Health data that shows a decline in opioid deaths in after 2018, I think from 2018 to 2019. I don't know what it's going to look like due to a variety of social harms from COVID. Here we go. Opioid-involved deaths and related harms. So this is a summary of what was on the CDC website, and go down to that very last bullet point. The number of deaths involving prescription opioids declined in 2018, and those involving heroin dropped. Unfortunately, right above it, you see deaths involving synthetic opioids continue to rise. So there is your problem, and that's the same everywhere. In Illinois, nearly 80% of drug overdose death involved opioids. A total of, you see the total of fatalities there. This is the most recent data from the CDC. You just go to cdc.gov/opioids, and you can look at all of this if you wish, but this is specific to Illinois, and that's the graph for heroin. Heroin and prescription opioid involved deaths declined. And of course, the problem is that the fentanyl deaths continue to rise. So if I went to the Illinois Department of Public Health website, and they've got an opioid data dashboard, and maybe we're tired of looking at all the dashboards. I know that we've been looking at the University of Washington and Johns Hopkins dashboard for COVID tracking, but I will say that this is what Illinois puts out on the left. Opioids, Illinois' other epidemic, and they mean other than COVID-19. So this was just taken yesterday from the Illinois Department of Public Health website. Drug overdose death, 80% were opioids. So that is everybody's problem in terms of overdose deaths. 2.3 times more opioid deaths than homicides. Look at the difference between 2013 and 2019 in terms of synthetic opioid overdose deaths, and that is fentanyl. What's on the right? That's the National Safety Council in Itasca, Illinois, and you know where that is much better than I do, but this is an Illinois-based organization that's grant funded. It's not a governmental organization. If you're looking for teaching materials and educational materials for opioids and a lot of other issues as well, this is a really good site. So it's the National Safety Council, NSC, National Safety Council, and they give you a lot of data, handouts, articles on what works for pain and why patients should turn away from opioids for acute pain. So here's an example of what it looks like on the National Safety Council website. Well, we all remember the 2014 move of hydrocodone to Schedule II status. So prior to that, in our oral surgery department, we got many phone calls requesting phoned-in refills as a follow-up to the initial prescription of hydrocodone acetaminophen. And after this law went into effect, the number of phone requests, according to our nurse administrators who keep track, dropped 80%. So what does that mean? That means that the drop represents people who wanted more, but weren't motivated enough to get more to actually make a visit to be seen by a clinician, either here in Iowa City or elsewhere. So that tells you a lot about the fact that hydrocodone was being consumed or sold or whatever it was because the surgery made it justifiable. So I guess, I've sort of come around on this. I was a bit upset, as were many folks in 2014, that we were saying, well, look, we're going to have to prescribe more hydrocodone for the one prescription because we don't have the option to phone it in. But that's actually the opposite of what's happened with everything that's happened in the world of opioid issues. We have dropped our tablet numbers substantially, even for sets of third molars with mandibular, full or partial bony impaction. So that has not happened. So you can see that the obvious advantages for something being Schedule II there. And I think everybody knows that. Well, if you go to the CDC and say, what's going on nationwide, and of course the lower right-hand corner would be heroin, so that's illicit, and there's all kinds of drugs of abuse that are pictured there. But I thought you'd want to see what's happening with prescribing practices across the United States. This is the most recent data there is. So hopefully we'll get more soon, but a percentage of persons who had at least one prescription filled for an opioid by age group. So you know who we're really concerned about? It's the 15 to 19 and the 20 to 24. And those are the two groups where we'd like to keep those percentages way down. As you go to older folks, it's highly unlikely that at age 64, I'm going to break bad. And I guess it could happen, but for the most part, what we want to do is protect the undeveloped brains that don't have the inhibitory pathways, because those folks are the unknowable risk individuals. So overall rates for annual opioid prescriptions filled per 100 persons have been going down. So what you want to see is those lines trending down, and you are seeing the lines trending down. We should look probably at the less than 3-day line. So if you want to look at the less than 3-day line, it's that sort of beigey, kind of a weird color there. I don't know what you'd call it, coffee with cream, or I don't know, meconium, whatever you want to call that color. And look at it going down. Everything is headed down in the United States from 2006 to 2018. So all those lines are going in the right direction, but you can't just cut people off and say, I am no longer going to prescribe opiates for you, even though I have prescribed them for your back pain for years. So there is a great concern out there among physicians about inappropriate discontinuation practices in patients who've been maintained on long-term opiates. I know you remember this from way back when. These are just the categories of opiates. And when we look at those, the phenanthrines are the ones we mostly prescribe: codeine, codone, morphine, morphone. And that's where opium is, milk of the poppy. That's also where some of the agonist antagonists are. So those are that's your main big group. I don't know any clinician that routinely prescribes pentazocine anymore. There was a problem 10 or so years ago with pentazocine being crushed up and injected to mimic heroin, intravenous heroin. It's called T's and Blues. It was combined with an antihistamine, so that was abandoned at that time. Plus, pentazocine typically only gives good pain relief in women. It's gender specific. We don't use a lot of phenylpipridines either. That's the meperidine group. Remember, that's your fentanyl group. We use a lot of fentanyl as an induction agent for office-based anesthesia in dentistry, and it's available as a lollipop, as a patch. It is not appropriate for dental pain management post-op. And even if a patient demands it, that doesn't mean you're prescribing it. And I'm sure you would look at that and say, yeah, that's completely inappropriate and not part of my armamentarium. Remember the old days with propoxyphene and the methadone group? Propoxyphene was taken off the market for cardiac toxicity in 2011. And some of us still miss it. It was Darvocet N100, that big orange tablet that you could use if a patient had what they called an allergic reaction to codeine or hydrocodone. And it wasn't as habituating. It was a Schedule 4, but that's gone. We don't see that returning. So that's not an option. So what is your other option then? It's tramadol. And don't forget one thing about tramadol. Tramadol is a codeine derivative. So if you have a patient who tells you that they had total body highs from codeine, you cannot prescribe tramadol. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we go forward, because again, if you're trying to adopt the European model is to use tramadol for post-surgical pain in dentistry. Of course, keeping in mind that most of those are simple TEs, simple tissue extractions, because since 2011, at least in the nationalized healthcare model, third molar extractions have not been the standard of care. So remember I mentioned this morphine milligram equivalent business, and I think that's something that we have to be conversant in as clinicians, because it's what your insurance, your prescription insurance provider uses. It's what Medicaid, Medicare use. We just had this happen the other day. We have some access to care issues with some of our Medicaid patients who cannot be seen for extractions, for example. They have pain, it's legitimate pain. Many of them have many other health problems that eliminate the use of nonsteroidals. It's been renal transplant waiting list week for me here in the college, actually the last week or so. And so you cannot use nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs on patients who are on the renal transplant waiting list. So you have to be able to provide some sort of pain relief if access to care is the issue. So you might say, well, it's too bad that that happens. Well, it is too bad, and we have to figure out how to manage those folks. So what I'm saying is we had to provide this woman with essentially 3 weeks of pain control so that she could at least sleep at night before she could present to have 3 carious breakdown teeth extracted. What did we do? Well, first of all, remember that if you write a prescription with the directions that stipulate more, that a 7-day supply or more, Title 19 or Medicaid will not allow that and will say that's a prior authorization prescription. And that's what happened in her case. So I told the student to prescribe less than 7 days. And I think he thought I meant, more, don't make it more than 7 days. So anyway, you can't prescribe 7 days worth according to the directions. So the pharmacist has to put in a day's supply, and it must be less than 7 days. So just FYI. Now, for most of your patients, you aren't going to prescribe any more than 1 to 3 days worth of an oral opiate. If it's an access to care issue, then using the appropriate SIG, what we said for that patient was we wanted her to have 1 a day at bedtime, but we couldn't write it for 1 a day at bedtime, number 20 tablets. So we had to write it, take 1 tablet up to every 8 hours as needed for pain. So then the 20 tablets became 6, or the 18 tablets, I'm sorry, became 6 days worth. So what I'm saying, and not too eloquently, is that keep your day supply under 7. Don't make it 6.5, just make it unambiguous. We changed the prescription to 18 hydrocodone acetaminophen tablets for that lady, and that gave her 18 days worth in our view, but according to insurance, it was 3 a day. So there you have the oral morphine. And in dentistry, we're not comfortable with morphine. And it's interesting what's happened in pediatrics. The pediatricians will tell us, morphine is the best opiate for children for moderate to moderately severe pain. I don't know anyone who's comfortable prescribing morphine immediate release tablets to a child. It just doesn't seem right. Codeine seems more appropriate, but for reasons we'll talk about, you cannot prescribe codeine for children, nor can you prescribe hydrocodone for children. So there you have your morphine milligram equivalents, and I've got it on another slide as well. The CDC, the FDA use these. It's also the standard used to prescribe, use prescribing guidelines established by the CDC and insurance companies. Codeine is not potent, as you know. And in your handout that I've got for you, one of the last pages has got a little chart, and it's got the equal analgesic doses. So if you're thinking, where is this in my handout? I think it's page 7 of your handout. Page 8 is a pediatric analgesic chart that you can use chairside. I don't know how you feel about codeine, but codeine has a lot of strikes against it. It is very difficult to get good efficacy with codeine for a variety of reasons. And it's also the highest histamine release of the oral opiates commonly used. So it's got a lot of adverse effects, and it's not very effective. So you couple those two together, and it's not a very attractive drug. I will say that it has less abuse potential because it doesn't cause the euphoria that oxycodone does, and it makes you throw up. So it's hard to be euphoric while throwing up. So codeine is the most constipating, and that happens immediately. But 2D6 genetic polymorphism explains the problems with safety and maybe efficacy. So I've got the common adverse effects, allergy and pseudoallergy, which I'll talk about. So this is the timeline for codeine use in children. And you might have found this out the hard way, because the recommendation or the rule came down from the FDA in January 11th of 2018, that said you can't use codeine in children. It's too dangerous. So if you were used to prescribing a little bit of liquid Tylenol and codeine, maybe for some bicuspid extractions, that ended in January of 2018. So here's the progression I just thought you'd want to see. The reason for the concern is because ultra rapid metabolizers of codeine and perhaps hydrocodone, both of which are dependent, and tramadol, all of which are dependent on 2D6 metabolism solely for biotransformation. Ultra rapid metabolizers have been implicated as deaths in children under the age of 12. So here is a chart you probably don't want to see right now, but it just sort of lays out for you the CYP metabolism profile of these drugs. So as you do a quick scan, you say, where is codeine? Yep, CYP metabolism only 2D6. And there's a lot of polymorphism out there. So some people don't have adequate CYP 2D6, so they would not be able to biotransform codeine to its active form. Codeine is methylmorphine. It has to be demethylated to become morphine. And some would be ultra rapid metabolizers, and giving codeine is like giving oral morphine to them. Very, very rapid onset. So you see that the 2D6 is the problem. So find your 2D6 in the column. And the two drugs that are most problematic are codeine and tramadol, both of which depend entirely on 2D6 for their detoxification. So what doesn't depend at all on CYP P450? Hydromorphone, that's Dilaudid, morphine. So there's your morphine. And that's why if you've ever had a pediatrician say to you at a, you're out at a social function and you're just talking, CYP 2D6 casually, the pediatrician says, yep, I use morphine now for kids for significant pain. You're thinking, that sounds like something that's not appropriate. The reason is what you're looking at right here. So hydrocodone is first line for us in dentistry. And why is it first line? And I get this question frequently, especially from oral surgeons who would prefer to use oxycodone. And I think many have switched to very limited tablet numbers of 5 milligrams of oxycodone because it's better tolerated and it's available without acetaminophen, which makes the combination of over-the-counter acetaminophen much less complicated. So there are advantages to that. Having said that, if you are not an oral and maxillofacial surgeon, I would suggest that most boards of dentistry would prefer that you use hydrocodone acetaminophen as your first line opiate. If you're going to prescribe an opiate, there's less euphoria production with hydrocodone. And because of its combination with acetaminophen, it perhaps is less likely to be ground up and injected. Those are some concerns, but it also makes you throw up more. It causes more histamine release, which is the pseudoallergy reaction. So it's not as pleasant. So you get less warm and floaty, less euphoria, more nausea, and therefore you're less likely to inappropriately take it. And I know that might sound odd, but that's just the way it is. So hydrocodone is less euphoriogenic. It's less pleasant to take. If a patient says, I throw up with hydrocodone, but I don't with oxycodone, is that a ploy to get oxycodone? No, it makes perfect sense from a pharmacodynamic standpoint that the patient would say that. Now you have to evaluate whether the patient who's saying that to you represents someone at high risk of substance use disorder or someone in their immediate family. We just had this yesterday where parents were demanding an opiate for a child and when it really wasn't appropriate. And turns out when I checked the prescription drug monitoring program, it was the father who had been seen at a pain management clinic out of town, far away from his hometown, which is odd also. So now you've got a problem. The problem is that the parents want you to prescribe for a child when the child doesn't really have an indication or a need and is sleeping fine at night. So that was a very complex issue there. So if you're thinking, well, why not just use hydrocodone alone? Zohydro is sustained release hydrocodone, but the doses are too big for us, and it's also slow onset. So what I'm saying is there's no hydrocodone alone marketed in the United States that's an appropriate dosage form for us in dentistry. So here's the little table, and this just helps you to put it in perspective in terms of morphine milligram equivalent. So this is equivalency to oral morphine. You see that hydrocodone is 1-to-1 with morphine, so that's easy for us. If you prescribe 8 5-milligram hydrocodone tablets with acetaminophen, that's 8 times 5, that's 40 morphine milligram equivalents on that entire prescription. And if you stay at less than 50 or 50 and less morphine milligram equivalents, you minimize risk to the patient. So many practices have opted towards keeping their total morphine milligram equivalent on their one prescription for their patient at less than 50 morphine milligram equivalents. And that is all based on this chart. Look at oxycodone. Oxycodone is more potent on a milligram basis than morphine or hydrocodone orally, and therefore it takes less milligrams to get up to 50 morphine milligram equivalents. So you can do the math on that. The methadone is listed there for prescribers who prescribe, heroin or morphine for heroin substance use disorder patients. And then there's the Dilaudid or hydromorphone. Look at that one. So it doesn't take much hydromorphone to get up to 50 morphine milligram equivalents. A total of 12 milligrams, that'd be 6 of the 2-milligram tablets, would be 48 morphine milligram equivalents. So you see how you use this? And try to stay under 50 morphine milligram equivalents in your single prescription, and that will minimize the risk. So this is just an explanation. Dosages at or above 50 increase your risk for overdose. It's twice the risk of overdose that having your total prescription at less than 20 morphine milligram equivalents is. So taking them all at once is what we're talking about here. So this is from the Centers for Disease Control, and that gives you an idea. 50 morphine milligram equivalents is 50 milligrams of hydrocodone. That'd be 10 hydrocodone 5, 300 or 325. So how should you use this? I think you should try to keep it at or below 50. And I'll talk about how you do that. But it's pretty straightforward, I think, from what you're seeing. You can probably figure out right off the bat, well, I'm just going to say that that's 8 5-milligram hydrocodone with acetaminophen tablets. That's 40 morphine milligram equivalents, and that's just going to be my top end. For prescribing, certainly if you prescribe 10 of the 5-milligram, that's 50. Certainly there are situations where you'd prescribe more than that, and I'm acknowledging that to you, but make sure that when you write the SIG, your day's supply doesn't hit 7, that you keep it at 6 or below, because you'll be taking a lot of phone calls at your practice from pharmacies saying that the claim has been rejected and it's going to require a prior authorization, when all it is a day's supply issue. So at the National Institute for Drug Abuse, there is this opioid and pain management continuing medical education center. I wanted to show it to you because I think the commonly held view is that heroin addicts exclusively evolve from being prescription opioid recipients. And there is a lot more to this than prescription opioid use. So this explains a recent study of heroin users in the Chicago metropolitan area identified 3 main pathways to heroin addiction: prescription opioid abuse, cocaine use to heroin use, and that I thought you'd be interested in, and then polydrug use, multiple substances to heroin use. So anybody who says, oh, club drugs, or of course the clubs are closed right now, but anyone who says to you Molly and MDMA and a variety of these other drugs that are used as party drugs, they're harmless. That isn't the case, especially in people with underdeveloped inhibitory pathways. So the younger you are, the riskier that behavior is. So this is the conclusion from the CDC Center for Medical Education. Prescription opioid use is a risk factor, but heroin use is rare in prescription drug users. Prescription opioids and heroin have similar effects, but different risk factors. There are a subset of people who have used prescription opioids that may progress to heroin use. And why do people turn to heroin? Because it's a lot cheaper than buying Percocet, which is oxycodone acetaminophen. And it's a lot easier to find than oxycodone tablets. Well, that leads me to show you one of my much look forward to mailings that I get. I still like to get things in the mail because I'm so old school. I need to go electronic, which you could do. This is called Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. It's a cheerful little missive of death and contagion. And I look forward to it because I can say, hey, I don't have rabies. And it always makes me feel good. If you look at the characteristics of initial prescription episodes and likelihood of long-term opiate use, this was one of the very comprehensive looks at how prescribers affect sustained opioid use. And so I want to show you this, and maybe I think I'll show it to you again later just to reiterate and to circle back. So take a look at days supply of first opioid prescription on the horizontal axis, and then you've got probability of continued use of opiates. Look at the solid line. It never hits zero. That is your basically small percentage of folks who once exposed to opiates will continue to seek opiates. Luckily, that's fairly small, but it's sitting at what? About 6% of the population, according to this. 3-year probability is down towards what, 3-ish%. So even at 1 day's supply, and so you see that those lines are flat. They're flat till about 3 days, and then they start to go up. So what does that tell us? Try to stay under 3 days or under for a duration of supply to minimize the risk of continued use. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is, how many prescriptions are you going to write for opiates for one surgical or procedural episode? I think for most of us now in dentistry, if it's soft tissue, you aren't going to prescribe opiates unless the patient has contraindications for the use of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories. And I don't mean intolerances, because we can figure that out, but I do mean contraindications, and that would be renal failure and patients who are on oral anticoagulants, the new ones, the Tran or the Bans, or the old one, warfarin, or patients who've had recent perforated gastric ulcers, patients who have had recent thromboembolic episodes. Don't forget that one. So there are a small subset of people for whom nonsteroidals are too risky. And so for those folks, we consider opiates. And this is number of prescriptions. So look at where the line starts for one prescription. About 5%-ish, 5%. And then look how fast those lines slope upward. So what you're seeing is, if you've got a patient who keeps demanding more prescriptions, you've identified a patient who's at high risk of continued substance use disorder. That's what you're seeing there. So to minimize the patient's risk, it's one and done with your surgical procedure, and you're going to use other methods to treat lingering discomfort in those patients. So those CDC guidelines lead us to conclude what? This. So minimize the risk of continued use of opioids using 311, which is what you used to see at the airports when we used to go to airports. Only 3 days or less worth of an opioid, only one prescription for one dental procedure. And that is a very good methodology that I think most of us now have adopted, regardless of the type of practice or the types of procedures that you do. Most patients do well, especially when they understand the risks of exposure to opiates. And I think in the past, those risks were either not known or not communicated adequately to patients. And I think a lot of it just wasn't known that single exposures could trigger seeking behavior in certain patients. One of those articles that was in the April 2018 ADA journal was this one about benefits and harms associated with analgesic medications used in the management of acute dental pain. And so that's what I was just talking about, benefits and harms. And Dr. Moore is the lead author on this. Dr. Mariotti from Ohio State, periodontist, is on there too. And if you look at efficacy data from high quality studies, and again, this is sort of mind numbing to a patient, you could clip out a little bit of this. First of all, is there any drug that has a 1 for number needed to benefit? You see the first column to the right of the drug name says number needed to benefit. That's what we use now to determine efficacy. So we want that to be 1. The best analgesic there is, if you were to give it, has about a 1.25. What does the number stand for? That means how many patients would I have to give this drug or drug combination to have one patient have at least 50% pain relief in the dosage interval? That's number needed to benefit. See, that's kind of a mouthful. It's easier to just say NNTB. But if you look at what's at the top, there it is. That is as good as it gets for oral pain relief, 1.5. And that's from Dr. Moore's study in the April 2018 issue of the ADA journal. So when your patients say, I don't believe you, this is what we refer to. As you go down the number needed to benefit and you see the numbers get bigger as you go down, where do you stop? Where do you say, I don't think it's worthwhile to give this drug. It just isn't effective enough. Certainly once you get to 3, that's a drug that's 33% effective. 1 in 3 patients, essentially, will have efficacy. And so this has more data in there. You can go down it yourself. You see that ibuprofen fast acting? That would be, I think that's the sodium one that we don't have in the United States. It's called Nurofen. It's available in the UK. So if you've had your UK friends say, oh yeah, I just take some Nurofen, you think, well, that sounds good. It sounds like it shuts your nerves down, but it's basically rapid dissolving ibuprofen in a sodium formulation. So what do we have that's close to that? Advil liquid gels. And I would suggest that everyone in a typical practice keep Advil liquid gel minis in the office. And I am using that as a brand name because the minis are especially useful. They have an onset of 18 minutes, which is very fast. The only thing faster is the liquid, which you'd have to give copious volume to a patient, an adult patient. So Advil liquid gel minis, I'm going to show you that. It's in the slides, so I'll show you, but that's a really good box to keep up on a shelf in a cabinet in a dental practice. They slide down very easily. They're easy to swallow and they rapidly dissolve. They're not very sticky in the esophagus, so it doesn't take a lot of water to wash them down if you want to use it as your pre-procedural analgesic. And then, of course, when the front office folks get that raging headache at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it works great for that too. So go down your list and you see what you've got for efficacy. And you're certainly seeing that acetaminophen plus oxycodone in big doses of oxycodone is less effective than ibuprofen 400 and 1,000 milligrams of acetaminophen. But notice that's a big acetaminophen dose, and I'm going to address that because I get questions like that all the time. Do I really have to give that much Tylenol to a patient? Isn't that too much? So I've got some data in these slides for you that's going to talk about that. So things continue to this is number needed to harm, number needed to treat to harm. And so what you see there is that the ibuprofen, here's the highest compared to placebo, how many people have adverse effects, reported acute adverse effect events percentage. And there you have 58%, but 28%. So it's 100% over 58 minus 28. So that's how you figure that out. But I'd like to look at these numbers. I like to look at raw numbers and say, look at how high these percent adverse events are versus the percent adverse events for something like this, or go down to, here we go. We have more adverse events with placebo. So look how low this number needed to harm. So this, you want the lowest number possible for it to be good. So I won't have time to go through all that, but I just wanted you to see that. But again, April 2018. Well, a couple more things. I think we'll take a break at 2:30 and then come back in about 10 minutes and resume if that's okay with everybody. And I'm just going to stay on if people have questions. If Ted's around and wants to moderate that, I can also click on the chat box at that time and see if there are any that I can just address in the chat box, because I know there are a bunch in the chat box that I haven't been looking at in the interest of time. So one question that I mentioned at the outset is, why are opioids so addicting? It's because we have opiate receptors all over our bodies, for one thing, and we have cannabinoid receptors all over our bodies as well. Multiple factors interact: environmental effects, genetic predisposition, which we've talked about a bit, and then the feeling of intense pleasure, and that's a critical reason for continued use. So that's what you really get into. The drugs stimulate mu receptors in the brain to produce and release dopamine. Remember what dopamine is. It's the pleasure chemical. And the normal feedback loop helps people avoid obtaining pleasure through unsafe or unwise actions. That normal feedback loop is impaired in people with substance use disorder. So in early stages, opioid stimulation of the brain's reward system is the main reason people continue to use the drug. And there are other things that produce pleasure. My drug of choice, would be what? Monster cookies right now. So opioids are prescribed to relieve pain, but when they're taken in the absence of significant pain, the activation of the reward process motivates repeated use. The compulsion to use opioids builds beyond simple pleasure. And this neurobiology is fairly recently elucidated. Tolerance and dependence and tolerance do develop. Tolerance develops to every effect of opiates except constipation, by the way. And dependence will produce withdrawal symptoms. And so this is just the mechanism of withdrawal. What happens if you stop cold turkey? And I did that 5 days after I had a knee replaced. I said, I've got to stop taking this oxycodone, which I did. And then I had predominant norepinephrine tone. In other words, increased sympathetic tone in the periphery is what I experienced. And I would just say, I just did not feel well. And that produced a variety of symptoms, which I'll show you. So it didn't take long, but I was taking 10 milligrams 4 times a day of oxycodone, which is a lot. It certainly isn't outside the normal realm of immediate post-op for total knee replacement, but it was at the end of 5 days, I was ready to be done. And this is what the signs and symptoms were: runny nose, runny eyes, dilated pupils, goose flesh, sneezing, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. So it almost felt like the flu. And those can get more severe as you withdraw from short half-life versus long half-life drugs. So there's your timeline. And mine didn't last very long. It was about 12 hours for onset and maybe a day because I hadn't been on it long. But treatment of opioid dependence disorder certainly would be much more pronounced in someone with a long use of high dose opiates. The treatment is setting specific. Remember that the most dangerous acute withdrawal is for alcohol, patients with substance use disorder with alcohol. But you have to have a physical evaluation, and medications can certainly ease the withdrawal symptoms. One thing I mentioned was the recidivism rate with these 30-day insurance covered in-facility programs. Treatments have to address all kinds of things. Can you imagine a 30-day or a 28-day treatment being able to rectify every problem on that slide. Certainly there are many, many factors, other substance use disorders that are superimposed, and then look at legal consequences, but there are so many. And then a big one is look up top, psychiatric comorbidity, and I'm going to show you the high rate of occurrence from an organization that tracks that sort of thing in the United States. I'm going to show you that. So, and I'm sure you're not surprised, but it's kind of good to see where that is and what that means. So there you have your medications, and I'm sure you've seen the Buprenex or buprenorphine or Vivitrol. Naltrexone, buprenorphine, and naloxone is called Suboxone. It's in a film that you put inside the mouth on the buccal mucosa. You see these kinds of ads now in medical journals. So treating addiction with naltrexone versus methadone. So there is a lot of sophistication now, and not just opioid replacement therapy, but using partial agonists or agonist-antagonist combos for a more refined approach without a lot of the adverse effects and stigma that methadone might have. And I think everybody knows about Narcan or naloxone, so I'm not going to belabor that, but it's available for injection. But certainly all your first responders have the nasal spray, and you can, in most states, buy the nasal spray. I don't know if you can buy it for a reduced price. I think I priced it out at $180 per spray unit, which seems a little steep to me if you're just going to buy it to have at your practice. Certainly if you're on chronic, relatively high MMEs, morphine milligram equivalents, you will probably have Narcan nasal spray or naloxone nasal spray in your house or with the patient. You don't prime these because the priming causes the release of the drug. You can re-administer every 2 to 3 minutes if the patient fails to respond, and you're looking at respiratory rate and somnolence, very depressed respiratory rate. Suboxone is something that your patients might tell you they're on, but here's the thing about Suboxone, they might not tell you they're on it, or might not tell you that it's been prescribed for them. We just had one of these cases happen in one of our clinics where the patient failed to tell us that she was on Buprenex, which is buprenorphine. And Buprenex is used to treat alcohol substance use disorder and opiate substance use disorder. She did not disclose it, so she was asking for hydrocodone as a prescription when she really probably wasn't an appropriate patient because of the type of pain that she had. So I looked her up on the prescription drug monitoring program, and there was her Buprenex prescription that she had gotten filled recently and had been on for the previous year. So sometimes patients, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but I'm just saying it's good to check. It's always good to check, and it's mandatory to check if you're contemplating an opioid prescription, because you can access some information that's going to help you to make the right decision. So that's what that looks like if you've ever seen that inside a patient's mouth, and it'd be stuck to the buccal mucosa. It's a buccal film. There's a sublingual tablet, and also a sublingual film for the brand name Suboxone, but there's some other brand names that you see there as well. Okay, it's 2:30, so I'm going to pause here, and we'll come back at 2:40, and hopefully that gives you enough time to grab some refreshments. And I'm going to take a look here at the chat box and see if there's anything that I can address.
Well, Karen, we have two questions that have been submitted. One is for clarification, is OxyContin still available for select cases of severe pain, such as total joint replacement?
The OxyContin is available, yes. So I will say that just having had that happen, that the physicians are very hesitant to use sustained release opiates because of what's happened in the past 6 or 7 years. So that was not offered as an option to me, and I know there are about 13 orthopedic surgeons in that practice. I don't know how it is with Dr. Berger in Chicago, but I suspect that most clinicians would try to avoid the sustained release opiates, but it is still available.
The second question is for clarification, is there a difference in efficacy between Advil liquid gels, and I think he means the Advil liquid gel minis?
Is there a difference in efficacy between the Advil liquid gels and the Advil liquid gel minis?
Yes.
Not that I've seen, and I've looked at the company data. So I haven't looked at any independently validated data, but when I look at the company data, it looks the same. So they're both 200 milligram. But the only reason I'm suggesting the minis is because of ease of use with minimal water if you're going to pre-procedurally dose it.
Those are the two questions that we've
Okay.
received so far. So,
and I see
rest your
people,
vocal cords for a minute.
okay. And I do see that people have printed off the handout. And as I said, I'll get you all the slides. So don't be concerned because they're very wordy. And I know that because I'm very wordy. So I will get you that. Dr. Stanford, I think, says I'm not in full presentation mode. So I might stop sharing and then come back in and reshare if I can do that.
We had one other question here that just came in. It says, why is it difficult to return drugs to the pharmacy? Also, patients have to pay a minimum charge. They don't just want 4 tablets.
Yeah, those questions are really good. So why is it difficult to return drugs to the pharmacy? Well, most pharmacies that I know of here have drop boxes with big padlocks on them for controlled substances. Your other drugs, they don't want. Your non-controlled substances, they certainly don't want, even though here at the college, a lot of people just bring us all their drugs. So that's kind of interesting. But a lot of pharmacies have heavy drop boxes that are padlocked that you can drop off. And then there are multiple times per year that are drug turn back or drug drop off dates where pharmacies more readily accept them. I know how busy pharmacies are, but as I say, a lot of them have drop boxes. So that might be a question. And I can just think of a couple that I use that have drop boxes. So anything controlled substance wise, you can put in there, and I'll talk about other options for you as well. And then I know the other thing is so the patient says to you, I have to pay $5 whether I get 4 tablets or 12. And I understand that that is the case. So the problem is that we have to do what's appropriate regardless of your copay. Now, if you're paying $15, that's a high copay, but that doesn't mean you're going to then say, well, I better triple the number of tablets. So I understand the concern. We hear that same thing at our pharmacy. We have a pharmacy right here at the College of Dentistry, but we are not able to increase number of tablets just based on the fact that you're paying $2 per tablet for the copay. That is not the criteria that we can appropriately use, and our state boards would not allow us to use that criteria in determining tablet numbers. So you could probably say that more eloquently than I just did.
There's a question about the handout. The handout is available online at cds.org in the section about regional meetings. And I assume that the slides will be placed there also when you make them available.
Yes. Ted, yeah, I'm going to send them to Angela. I tried to send them to her before the program, but apparently as I was in the program, it was returned because the file was too big. Even a PDF file was too big. So I'm going to break that up and then send it maybe in a couple different handouts, but you'll get all the slides.
Thank you.
Okay. See you back in a few.
Okie doke.
So far, and we'll leave some time at the end of the program, which would be at about an hour. and get that. And I have my laser pointer here for you as well. Remember that slide I showed you that had the 33% increased risk among adolescents for opioid misuse if they were exposed as opioid naive teenagers? That comes from the journal Pediatrics, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics, November of 2015. And that was a lot of high school students surveyed in the 12th grade, and then they were followed through age 23, not quite to, the age of inhibitory pathways. Results were legitimate opioid use before high school graduation is independently associated with a 33% increase in the risk of future opioid misuse after high school. The association was concentrated among individuals with little or no history of drug use, strong disapproval of illegal drug use at baseline, short-term opiates to relieve pain were what was prescribed, and it was mostly for dental extractions. So that was where that 33% came from. So that is quite alarming. And I think it's the genetic predisposition meets the immature brain. That is a very bad combination, and we realize that now, and that's why we talk with the patient and we talk with mom and dad and say, this might not be the best way to go, and we find very good effectiveness with a non-opiate alternative, or you may even want to just approach it a different way. I prescribe ibuprofen and acetaminophen for pain post third molar extractions. Be a bit more proactive than that due to the risks, the unknown risks associated with even one prescription exposure to opiates. So you can sort of practice in the mirror in the morning how you want to say that, but I think you all have done that, and a lot of folks in practices tell me they don't even prescribe opiates anymore because the combination of ibuprofen and acetaminophen, or you could use naproxen sodium and acetaminophen taken concomitantly, and that's very important. You have to take them at the same time, gives you such great pain relief. And it is kind of astounding. Even my dental students are astounded when their significant others have mandibular, full or partial bony impaction surgery. I just had one not long ago say, I thought he was going to be a big baby. He didn't complain once, and he usually complains about everything. I said, well, what did you give him? Just what we learned, ibuprofen 800 and 1,000 of acetaminophen 4 times a day on a schedule, and ice on and off, and he was fine. So it's always good to hear the students say, you might know what you're talking about. I mean, I didn't think so, but now that my boyfriend survived, I think you know what you're talking about. Genetic predisposition meets the immature brain is what we were talking about. The brain doesn't mature till mid-20s, and it's the last place to be fully myelinated is the front of the brain, and that's the prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex, responsible for insight, empathy, impulse control, and risk-taking behaviors. So there are some people that you probably know, and they're probably fun at a party, but not so much fun full-time, that say things like, you're not going to believe what I'm going to do now. And it's like, well, I probably won't. And luckily, I don't have to live with you. Teenagers are more prone to addiction and are thrill seekers. That's not an overgeneralization. That is pretty well known. And I think that anyone who's been around them knows that. So it's like a car with a good accelerator and a weak brake. That's what the developmental psychologists. So there the little darlings are. And so why were the students who hadn't used drugs in the past and were the most opposed to illicit drug use the ones more likely to abuse opioids in the future? That I struggle with. There may be a lot of things there going on that we don't know about, that weren't really demographically identified in that study in pediatrics. But my opinion is you've got that combination, and it may be in people who perhaps had kept things fairly locked down and were hard workers and responsible. And once you feel what it feels like to be euphoric on the wild side, that opens a whole new world to you. So there are a variety of things that have gone on. So how are we going to identify who that young person is that is at highest risk? I've looked and looked and looked around for a brief opioid risk tool that might be amenable to dental use in a patient. For example, if they're in the chair and the parents are demanding opiates and saying, look, you need to take good care of my son or daughter, and that will involve making sure that they're knocked out and that they don't have to be awake for this pain. And that means during and after. And we've certainly had those experiences. So one of the things that can be used is some of these risk tools. Some are very long, 30 questions, for example. This one is the shortest one I can find that has been validated. I will say this, none of these reliably identify patients from a prospective basis. And so I wish I could tell you that this works. I suspect as you're looking at these questions, you know why it doesn't work. If you don't tell the truth, this is all self-report. If you don't tell the truth, if you're not perfectly transparent and straightforward, this is a useless tool. So what you can see is that the patient doesn't see the numbers. The patient just sees blanks. And then they say yes or no to the questions on the left. So there you have your questions. And these are very sensitive questions, first off. So then you see the risk weight assigned. If the patient has had personal history of substance abuse with prescription drugs, they get a 5 right off the bat. There even are some things that might surprise you down here. Attention deficit disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a separate disorder. It used to be an anxiety disorder. Now it's been separated out in the DSM-5. You check it, it's on your phone. Oh, that's my phone. And bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, and then depression. So what you do is you say yes, yes to certain of these, yes, no, you go down this list, then that gives a weight of whatever you see here, depending on gender. And you see some of these are higher in males because males are more likely to be risk takers, and males are much more likely to have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder than females. Then you get a score. Anybody that gets a score of 8 is at high risk. A score of 4 to 7 is moderate risk. A score of 3 or below is low risk. So the reason I showed that to you is because I want to give you an idea of what the really high risk factors are. So perhaps in the patient's history, your health history, they have indicated some of these things. So you could actually mentally score this patient to some extent without having to have them take this tool. So I hope that that would help you to sort of put things in perspective and say, based on the fact that this patient has a family history, because I treat everybody in the family, a prescription drug, a substance use disorder, and the patient is young, and the patient has ADHD and OCD, you know, you're going to say that patient falls into moderately high risk, and I'm not going to justify using opiates in that patient. So you can see how you can sort of mentally score that patient without having to perhaps administer what a patient would think would be very invasive or perhaps even pejorative. You either administer it to everybody or probably don't administer it to anybody. And we've had some real issues with selecting for whom that risk tool would be administered. I don't see any problem with selective administration. I mean, if I've got a 65-year-old lady with no history of any sort of substance use disorder, I'm not going to administer that test to her. But so I promised you the mental health disorder slides that just show you the correlation between substance use disorder and mental health disorders. And it's from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, well-regarded group that looks at the correlation between mental health disorder, MHD, and substance use disorder. So look at the highest correlation, and it's up to a 40% correlation. Look at that. So there they are. And then next, bipolar, then schizophrenia, Boy, a lot of folks have anxiety disorders. I count on anxiety as motivation, so perhaps I'm an anxiety disorder abuser. I don't know, but and then on down the line, the lowest is 10% for mental health disorders. And see, the overall population risk is about 2%. So I wanted you to see that because I think that's instructive. And then how they break down and percent co-diagnosed with substance use disorder by substance. So that's a lot of detail, but let's look at the one that is sort of and appropriately green, I guess, would be marijuana. And I'm not talking about CBD, which I am going to mention, because a lot of folks say, well, I could use CBD oil for pain. But I'm talking about THC here, the psychoactive part of the plant that produces THC, and that would be green. And what you see is a lot of people self-medicate for depression with alcohol and with marijuana and with opiates and with cocaine. So look at how high these are. That's a really high percentage across the board for the different substances. This one's fairly high as well. So bipolar affective disorder and depression are both fairly high for self-medication. Have you noticed those commercials on TV for Fanapt? Fanapt is an iloperidone. That is an antipsychotic that's brand name. That's why you're seeing it on television. So it's just odd to see ads on TV about schizophrenia and tardive dyskinesia, because you typically don't, but we're seeing ads for Abilify. Abilify is an antipsychotic as well, but it's now generic, so you don't see them anymore. So the high dollar expense drugs are the ones you're going to see advertised on expensive mediums. So I wanted you to see this. Average use over all mental health disorders, alcohol is the highest rate of use just in general. But the highest rates of use, to generalize, are first of all with depression, then probably bipolar disorder and schizophrenia quite close. So I just gave this lecture yesterday, and this really hits home with what you see in real life in your practice. So that begs the question, how can dentists evaluate the opioid risk? I wish I could tell you the tools were good. They're not predictive. They've shown to be valid in certain models, but then when you try to line them up to get them to be predictive and on a large scale, I think what happens is you don't get candid responses, and that sort of ruins the effort. Many mental health disorders can predispose to substance use disorder. The patients may not report these disorders. Universal precautions, we use that. You're using so much PPE right now. Universal precautions must therefore be applied, and behavior flags and prescription drug monitoring programs can help. So almost 40% of substance use disorder patients have a personality disorder. And if you look up personality disorders, there are many types, among them narcissism, situational dependence, or overly dependent personalities, patients who depend on you to fix them. I think some of this might sound familiar and is kind of good. Who would have thought that it would be good to do a quick psychological review in dentistry? But I think it's probably good to look at personality disorders and to say, you know, this patient that I have that's constantly putting their health in my hands as my responsibility and doesn't seem to take responsibility, that is a type of personality disorder. And personality disorders are broad and multifaceted. Some have very debilitating effects on the person, and others have less debilitating effects and can be somewhat mitigated, controlled with insight. So where does that leave us? So if you're trying to make the decision, right, about opiates, because that's what we've been talking about this whole time. We're trying to make the decision, and that really good question at the break was, my patient's upset that they only got 4 tablets because they have to pay the same copay no matter what. So that begs the question, how many tablets are appropriate? So the guidelines now that most dental organizations, and I include the ADA AGD, AAOMS, American Academy of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgeons use is 3 days or less, 50 morphine milligram equivalents or less. That's it. And if you do that, you will not run afoul of not only state dental boards, but also you will not run afoul of any sort of requirements from insurance companies and care providers and the like. So, but the main thing you want to do is you don't want to put a patient at an inordinate risk, and that's something that you would never want to do. So one thing that we do, and look at what we do at the dental pharmacy, is we tell patients to put dishwashing liquid on any remaining tablets, and that basically turns them into a paste. They sort of blow up and it turns them into a paste and they're unusable. Then you can throw them away. Don't put them in the trash. I know this sounds hopelessly paranoid. The older I get, the more paranoid I am. Maybe that's a mental disorder, but just don't throw them away intact, nice and pristine. Ruin them first and then throw them away. So if you don't have a cat, and the kitty litter is kind of gross anyway, I think the main thing is to destroy the tablets. And how you do that is you put your liquid dishwashing soap, which is very detersive. It just sort of blows apart the tablets after it sits on them, becomes this indistinct paste, and then you throw them away. I've mentioned this before, but I think that our experience of the last 5 years or so, and it has been that the concomitant use of the nonsteroidal and the acetaminophen given in moderate to high doses at the same time on a scheduled basis is the most opioid sparing regimen in dentistry. So I think that you're going to find if you do that, you're going to be able to greatly reduce the number of opiate prescriptions you issue, the number of opiate tablets you need to prescribe for your patients, and still have high patient satisfaction. There will always be an element, a component of your patient base that says he or she is a terrible dentist because they didn't meet my needs. Well, the problem with that is that your needs were not needs, they were wants, and there were other mitigating factors. So I think that it's a difficult conversation to have in a patient, especially one who's getting upset. But you have to ask yourself, how normal is that a patient would get upset at the request for a specific medicine? Most of us would say, oh, well, you know best. I mean, you obviously know what works in your practice, so fine, I'll do that. But if a patient is arguing that everything else is like water, there's probably a personality disorder involved. There may be other disorders involved. There may be a previous substance use disorder involved. So then it gets very complicated. Just had a pediatric dentist, as I was saying on the phone yesterday, with an autistic child whose parents basically wanted the opiates. So things get very, 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 very difficult. Combining ibuprofen and acetaminophen gives you synergism. It was first identified in 2010, very well fleshed out in 2013. I still get questions about this. You know who they're mostly from? Physicians, physicians' assistants, and nurse practitioners. And they will call here and say, what are you teaching those dental students? I say, what do you mean? Narrow that down. And about pain control, because they are prescribing way too much acetaminophen, way too much ibuprofen, and they're telling patients to take it at the same time. All of that is inappropriate. And all of those things are perfectly appropriate for our setting, maybe not the pediatrician setting, maybe not the family practitioner setting. But for ours, that is the way that we avoid opiates. So the first thing I say is that we use the combination at the same time for synergistic effect to avoid opiates. That usually stops things. And then they say, well, you still use too much. And I'm going to talk about the doses. So in the next slide. So you will get some pushback, but the doses for lowering a fever are definitely lower than the doses for control of osseous pain in oral surgical procedures. So I just want to tell you this 2013 article was excellent in JADA, and it was also associated with lower adverse effects. And there was what was used plus acetaminophen. Here's where you added the acetaminophen. So I think the question comes up, do you automatically tell patients they should take both at the same time? And the answer is no. You're going to use minimal amounts of drugs because that minimizes adverse effects no matter what situation you're in. But I will tell you that if you have done substantial trauma, you have a substantially traumatic surgery, you may as well start with both together. And that would be, and if you anticipate this pain, moderate to severe pain, then you are going to go with this kind of a regimen. Notice what that dose is, and I will clarify that. 1,000 every 6 hours of acetaminophen, and that would be in somebody that does not have liver disease, is not an alcoholic, and is actually eating. And I'm going to explain the glutathione thing in just a second. So patients they shouldn't be fasting when they take that much acetaminophen. Fasting predisposes to acetaminophen liver toxicity, as does dehydration, and of course, pre-existing liver disease. I'm also going to show you some forms that you can print out and modify for your own use that just lay out exactly how you want patients to take their either over-the-counter or prescribed ibuprofen plus the acetaminophen. As you know, there is an ibuprofen acetaminophen combination called Advil dual action, and I'll show you that. I wanted to say something about CBD because it is everywhere. It is the panacea. So the question is, can I just use CBD for dental pain? And these are just a couple of ads I took down from the internet. Applying CBD directly to the affected tooth or gums will work more effectively than taking it any other way. I think if you really had pulpal pain, that is not going to be adequate. One thing I would suggest is if you are answering a lot of questions about CBD or another substance called Kratom, which I'll show you in a second. Kratom is also legal in Illinois, I know that. I would suspect that you need something like Consumer Lab. I don't have any affiliations with any sort of commercial enterprises, but I will tell you that Consumer Lab will help you in your practice. So Consumer Lab is $34 a year. So that's a nice price for what you get. And you get things like a summary of what is CBD, what does it do? It lists all the studies for you. What to look for. And then look how nice this is. If you can find a study that shows X number of milligrams of CBD does this or that for TMD pain or tooth pain, the next question is, so which one should I get? Believe me, I could order 40 different CBDs on my Amazon Prime account as soon as we're done here today. So what you see there is cost for 10 milligrams of CBD. And I think that's a very good thing to look at. Remember that a lot of CBD, it's from hemp, so it can be contaminated with pesticides. The FDA is busy these days with recalls and warnings about therapeutic claims for CBD. For example, CBD has been shown to be effective in treating Parkinson's disease. It has not Alzheimer's type dementia, counteracts the growth and spread of cancer. So these are the kinds of statements that CBD companies cannot make. And here are the, so you can always go on Consumer Lab and find the companies that have been warned about making claims. I did notice, I mean, since I don't go anywhere or do anything, I don't get spray tans, but I did notice that my spray tanning place puts CBD oil in the spray tan solution now. How should I feel about that? Can I drive after tanning? I'm not sure. Well, I wanted to mention Kratom, it's spelled with a K, because Kratom has opiate activity. And you see right here, CBD Kratom has retail locations throughout Chicagoland. And our stores carry the largest CBD product line. And don't forget your Kratom selection, 45 strains of pure Kratom, the largest selection in the Midwest. What is it? We're talking opiates. Why am I talking about this? Because this is a tropical evergreen tree but it has opiate activity. So I think it's appropriate to talk about it. And I will tell you that a fair number of folks endeavor to stop their chronic substance use disorder, opiate substance use disorder, by turning to Kratom instead. So if and we have patients who tell us they take Kratom because they say it's an herb, and therefore I take that for relaxation instead of taking opiates. So you can see you have all kinds of different strains that the PhD pharmacologist, psychopharmacologist who works at the CBD Kratom shop can help you with. How does Kratom affect the brain? It's similar to opioids and stimulants, and there's a paradox, isn't it? So they interact with it interacts with opioid receptors in the brain, producing sedation, pleasure, decreased pain, especially when large amounts are consumed. Mitragynine also interacts with other receptor systems. Small amounts increase energy, sociability, and alertness. However, Kratom can also cause uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous side effects. During my lecture, one of my students sent me this. She was out running. She said, look what I found on my circuit in Iowa City. So you see Sunstone Organics Kratom sold here. So what should we think about Kratom? I think that it bears asking if you are you taking anything over the counter like CBD or Kratom? Kratom is worth mentioning because it can have stimulant effects in low doses, sedation effects in high doses, and it's something that we don't want patients to use. So if they tell it just prior to a surgery for office-based anesthesia purposes. Okay. So talking about, I know there've been some questions about, so what's the exact regimen and what do we recommend? And that's really where we're going now. So I wanted to be very specific about what the opioid epidemic and what we know about opioids means for us. And I mentioned this article before that was very recently published in the JADA, and it is Is it time U.S. dentistry ended its opioid dependence? And then just now I got my compendium of continuing education in dentistry, and a really nice CDE article came out called Prescribing Analgesics for Post-Operative Dental Pain. And I've got right here, because I was doing a little bedside table reading with it, the Ray Dion, very accomplished and well-known researcher in the area of pain and anesthesia. He wrote an editorial in Journal of Dental Research called "Is the Mission Accomplished for the Management of Acute Oral Pain Without Enabling Substance Abuse?" So in other words, are we done here? Do we know enough? And, basically what Dr. Dion said, and this was in the Journal of Dental Research, just published, what Dr. Dion was opining was that there is too much interpatient variability for us to declare victory and to go home. And then along with that, I think I'll probably have a screenshot for you of the Journal of Dental Research article that's very similar to this article, because Dr. Hirsch and Dr. Moore are the first two authors. So as you can see, they are a dynamic duo. They've done such wonders with helping us through all this and being great resources for us in clinical dentistry. But as I said, the research into effectiveness of nonsteroidals began in 1976 with Dr. Sunshine and Dr. Stephen Cooper, and it is continued from that time. So anybody who says, I've never heard that before, obviously is not in the habit of reviewing pain literature as it relates to dental practice, because this has been around for many, many years, 40 and more years. So the Prescribing Analgesics for Post-Op Dental Pain was a nice article, not long, in Compendium, and I did, with attribution, show one of the figures in that article that I'll show you in just a minute. So, you have that handout that Angela posted this morning on the CDS website related to this meeting. And it's a PDF handout. And this is, I think, the first thing that you see when you look at the handout. And this is certainly the 3D strategy that you would normally deploy: diagnosis, definitive dental treatment, and drugs. So if you look at the left-hand side, that's when you can use nonsteroidals. The right-hand side is when you can't use nonsteroidals. So what if a patient says they're allergic to acetaminophen? We get that every once in a while. So asking the patient what happened, typically hives is the answer. Acetaminophen is not very allergenic, but nothing is impossible. Certainly you can be allergic to acetaminophen. It's just very rare. So that eliminates the use of acetaminophen, and that's a big problem for us in dental practice. There are some combinations of nonsteroidals and opiates that can be used. I'm sure you're familiar with Combunox and Vicoprofen. Those are in the handout as well for you. That would be an alternative for a patient with a true acetaminophen allergy. But in terms of low risk of adverse effects and high return, being able to use acetaminophen with the opiate is probably the best way to go. And typically we're not going to go any farther than oxycodone 10 milligrams at a time. And most procedures would not require that. If you talk to your local friendly oral surgeons and you say, so tell me what you typically do now for a set of third molars, I think a lot of those folks are going to say 5 milligrams of oxycodone, take 1 tablet every 6 hours as needed, maximum of 4 per 24 hours, and give them 8 tablets and maybe 12, particularly distoangular mandibular impaction surgery. So it's really going to be quite limited. As I said, I took oxycodone 10 milligrams at a time along with all the other non-narcotics for total knee replacement and stopped that at 5 days. Just using, I'm an N of 1 though. Then you have the World Health Organization analgesic pain ladder, and this has really been a difficult thing to deal with for us in dentistry. The reason is, look at the lowest step. The lowest step is exactly what we're telling them to take. And if I'm a patient, I look at that and say, I want to go to step 3. I want the good stuff. And that's exactly what the perception is, that we're trying to keep them at an ineffective level in pain treatment. But actually what the first step indicates is incredibly effective and foundational. But a patient would not look at that and think that. They would think it's the least effective. I want to go up. Now, as you look at this, you're not seeing hydrocodone. Remember I said hydrocodone is really not used in Europe. This is sort of a European and Canadian model. So where would hydrocodone lie in the steps? It would be a half step about right there. Probably about right there. Certainly it's more potent than codeine and tramadol, and I've got your relative equal analgesic doses listed for you in that table, as I mentioned. Should you ever go here in dentistry? Absolutely not. That step is not appropriate for ambulatory office-based dentistry. Is this step ever appropriate? That is, perhaps there's some trauma where you're sending the patient home. Hydromorphone, remember, is an MME of 4 versus hydrocodone at an MME of 1. So keep that in mind as you're looking at that. A patient who asks you for hydromorphone has had opioid experience, and you should remember that you are not obligated to provide the same opiate effects for different types of procedures. So if the patient says, oh yeah, I always get hydromorphone for all my abdominal surgeries, this is not abdominal surgery. This is the extraction of 2 periodontally involved teeth. Completely different situation, completely different needs in terms of pain control. But we hear that a lot. No, the thing that I always get, because I've had a lot of surgery, is hydromorphone. And that's understandable. Abdominal surgery, spinal surgery, I understand that, but not for most procedures in dentistry. And I think your state boards would have a problem with first-line use of hydromorphone for most ambulatory dental procedures. So there you have your armamentarium. And somebody already asked about the COX-2 selectives. We only really have one that's highly COX-2 selective, and that's Celebrex, generic Celebrex. Don't forget about your options with corticosteroids. You can inject directly into the area. You can give an injection into the line if you have an IV sedation case, which is what most of the oral surgeons would do, and the periodontists, for example. And then you go down to tramadol and then opiates. So you notice the order I've got these in: acetaminophen, NSAIDs, tramadol, opiates. That is probably the approach you'd want to take, is for mild pain, acetaminophen alone; for mild to moderate pain or advancing pain, non-steroidals alone, or non-steroidals plus acetaminophen, depending on the situation and the trauma. You only use tramadol if you cannot give non-steroidals. So tramadol you would substitute in for non-steroidals if non-steroidals are contraindicated, and then opiates. And there are some problems, of course, that we get into. On the next page of your handout, you've got something we call the dose response curve. And again, if your patient looks at this, they say, see, I told you, this is what I want. I want the one that's the highest line. It's the steepest line. This is a dose response curve, and it gets to be the highest. What this curve does not show you is that this patient is having difficulty with respiratory depression at that level. So I guess your pain is not your problem at that point. So we don't want to go up there because it's not appropriate or indicated for an ambulatory patient. So, and also remember, anybody can say to you, any pharmacologist can say to you, opiates are the most potent analgesic. That is absolutely true, but potency does not equal efficacy. So do not let that intimidate you if you get told by someone, a physician, for example, well, you've got to use the most potent pain reliever. The best one is always the most potent one. That's not true. The most effective one is the one that works. That's what you say. And I have to look at the clinical data to know what works for my procedures in my practice. So non-steroidals demonstrate shallow dose response. You see that flat efficacy with increasing dosage. Of course, these questions that are asked in this particular pain intensity difference scale do not assess swelling or trismus. Don't say pain on mouth opening or do a digital analysis of trismus, or swelling reduction. So remember that these kinds of pain scales aren't good assessments of anti-inflammatory effect, only just reported pain on a scale. So what I'm saying is that higher doses of ibuprofen and other non-steroidals are more effective for inflammatory pain, and I'll get to that. Acetaminophen 1000 is more effective than acetaminophen 500. I'm going to show you this because I keep seeing the statement, always use lower doses of acetaminophen because it doesn't do any good to go up. And I think that is forcing some folks to then have to use opiates because they're not getting enough efficacy. So the mechanism of action of acetaminophen, we finally understand, and the big joke among pharmacologists who don't have a lot of jokes is that, yeah, we're using this drug for years and we have no idea how it really works. But it turns out that what seems to happen in the periphery is that here we have non-steroidals and here we have acetaminophen. So do you see these two lines? These are sequential steps in the production of inflammatory mediators. And anytime you inhibit sequential steps, you get synergism. So this is a really good depiction of why the drugs are synergistic. And that's why we give them at the same time. We want them to peak at the same time. This was first, I think, elucidated in about 2003, and then further elaborated as time went on. And you can read more about it. This is a bit busy. Also, there are some people who have inflammatory mediators that are primarily HETEs, and lipooxygenase mediated. So in other words, you get arachidonic acid forming due to trauma. You don't get arachidonic acid forming if you're on corticosteroids. But in our case, in most of our cases, we're not on corticosteroids. So most of the pain is produced by these pathways, the blue pathways. Some folks have a lot of lipooxygenase pathway pain, and they might respond better to an acetic acid nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug, which I will get to. So here's your dosing. You'll still have nurses and PAs say to you, maximum is 3,000. Nope, maximum's 4,000. Go to FDA.gov, Health Protection Canada, it's 4,000. Now we know that we don't just give 4,000 to everybody. Maximum acute use by patients, if they supervise themselves, is 3,000. Maximum chronic use without monitoring is 2,600. Toxicity is greatly increased by fasting and or alcohol consumption. That's 2 alcoholic drinks or greater than 2 alcoholic drinks per day. And, you know, even Tylenol increases bleeding with warfarin. There are multiple factors in play there. So this is the FDA. This is straight from the FDA site. This is straight from Health Canada. There it is, 4,000. I'm showing it to you because I have these phone calls all the time. Show me where it says that. Okay. And then I send them this. And I don't mean to make it sound like it's a big argument. It's just that a lot of folks are very, very convinced that you can never recommend more than 3,000 milligrams of acetaminophen for an adult, a healthy adult in the United States. A lot of that's due to the fact that the maximum per combination tablet is now down to 325. You don't want to probably see this at this point in time, but I will tell you that this is the pathway to hepatotoxicity. Look what causes hepatotoxicity. Glutathione depletion versus having enough glutathione. Remember I said you have to eat when you take a lot of Tylenol? So glutathione is found in large measure in fresh fruits and vegetables. And, you know, you got an oral surgery patient, they're not going to have a salad. So you need to do smoothies. You need to get the NutriBullet out or whatever you've got, or the immersion blender, whatever it is, and just get serious about having healthy food that contains glutathione if you're taking that much Tylenol. So remember, acetaminophen toxicity is predisposed by glutathione depletion. This is that toxic metabolite. And how can you get glutathione in a smoothie? Well, skip the chia seeds. That's super annoying post-surgical. So you can skip that. And chia seeds are dropping off radically in use by a lot of folks. But you need protein powder, you need spinach, strawberries, blueberries, and avocado. And that is a high dose glutathione smoothie. So I can't emphasize enough, if you are going to take high dose acetaminophen short term, you have to eat and you shouldn't drink anything. So 4,000 milligrams a day means no alcohol and having healthy food. And it's mostly the fruits and vegetables that the glutathione is contained in. The question your patient asks you is, which works better, 2 Advils or 2 extra strength Tylenols? The solid line is, this is a multi-center, multi-etiology pain trial. We participated in this. The solid line is 2 Advils for pain. The higher the line, the better. 2 Advils, 2 extra strength Tylenols. Time and time again, that's what you're going to see. So remember I promised you I was going to show you this. I just want you to see this. This was a Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies investigation of which works better, 1,000 milligrams of Tylenol or 600 or 650. And here are the conclusions. Our conclusions agree with reports in the Food and Drug Administration that found early evidence that 1,000 milligrams is more effective than 650 in various pain conditions. So I just want you to have that in case you're challenged or in case you're asked why you're using the big dose when everybody knows that 500 and 650 work just as well. So here you have, this is fast dissolving. That's what FD stands for. But the blue line is 1,000 for pain relief. And the red rectangles are 500. This is mean pain relief score. Again, a different study. and there's 650. So there you have it. I wanted you to see it because I do think that that's something worth doing, using 1,000 instead of 650 or 500 if you're trying to avoid using opiates. So there's your dosing. And this is just what's in your handout, but I just wanted to say that this is the toxicity issue. 10 grams as a single dose has been known to be potentially toxic to liver cells. So remember the dehydration or infrequent meals, alcohol use, 2 drinks a day and up, and 2 drinks is either 2 5-ounce glasses of wine or 2 mixed drinks using distilled spirits. Pre-existing liver disease, I do have that information for you on a slide as well, and I think I'll give it to you as a handout as well. The Pew score for liver disease, I'm going to give you your dosage guidelines for nonsteroidals and for acetaminophen based on your liver disease, your liver failure score. And a lot of times patients will just say, I have liver disease. And believe me, if they tell you they have liver disease, you're going to assume it's fairly serious. You'll try to get some clarification on that, certainly, but I know how that goes if you're trying to do, if it's a busy day for everyone and you're trying to get an answer to that from the nurse at the physician's office, it's very, very difficult. So number needed to treat would be your standard assessment. This is the Oxford League table of analgesic efficacy. That's a British thing. It's not a soccer league, but what you see is that ibuprofen, these are all mandibular third molar extraction studies. So that's why I'm showing you this. So this is published by Bandelier, and this shows that ibuprofen 800 gives you a number needed to treat to benefit. So that's the same as what we looked at before, of 1.6. There's Toradol, ketorolac 20. There's ketorolac 60. So look how effective that is. Then there is, look at oxycodone 5, acetaminophen 500, immediate release oxycodone 15 milligrams. Then there's ibuprofen 600 and 400. Now, these are mandibular third molar extraction. So I'm showing you this so that you know that efficacy-wise, the higher dose was more effective for trismus and swelling. And so it's the anti-inflammatory dose that counts in mandibular impaction surgery. And then the worst looking one, number needed to treat, was codeine 60 milligrams. So really, really ineffective. So the Cochrane Library did a similar analysis comparing single doses of oral analgesics for acute pain in patients. This was not dental. This was all types of operative pain. But again, you see a very similar outcome. Atoracoxib is a COX-2 selective in Europe. And here is your ibuprofen and acetaminophen. So that's 400 plus 1,000, looked the best. And you want it to be as close to 1, which is this line, as possible. What looked the worst? Codeine 60 milligrams. That's due to a lot of factors, but boy, this is very, very consistent. So what do we have for over-the-counter? We're not going to use aspirin because it causes too much gastrointestinal havoc for the efficacy that it produces. So we're not going to use that one. Luckily, we have nonsteroidals. Acetaminophen, remember it comes in, if someone says, I've got Tylenol, make sure you're talking about the same dose. Most people don't have the arthritis strength, which is the 650. Every once in a while, we'll get somebody that's using the 650. So don't just assume that it's always either 325 or 500. Ibuprofen is 200. There's your maximum over-the-counter dose, which is very low for our purposes. There's your Advil dual action, and it's 125/250. So what you have is you take 2 of those up to 3 times a day. So your maximums are 1,500 and 750. And actually I've got that, you know, and I have that flipped around. So it's 1,500 of the acetaminophen and 750 of the ibuprofen. Sorry about that. I'll change that before I post them for you. Anyway, it's very low. It's 125 of ibuprofen and 250 of acetaminophen per tab. And then you take 2 tabs and you get 250 of ibuprofen and 500. I guess that's why it was designed that way. But you can only take 3 a day. Are there concerns that we have about cardiovascular patients? And everybody's been concerned all during the COVID epidemic about hypercoagulability and cardiovascular disease patients, hypertensive patients. There certainly are alerts that we in Canada and the US use. And so the classification of high dose ibuprofen is 2,400 milligrams and up. I wanted to show you that there are warnings about recent thromboembolic episodes. So basically, if a patient's just had an acute coronary syndrome and just been shunted or stented, I should say, stented, or just had a bypass operation, but it's usually stents, they should not receive non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So those warnings I've got on the slides, but I'm putting them here as well. So the FDA approves OTC combination. You see when that was? March 4th of 2020, 125 of ibuprofen, 250 of acetaminophen per tablet. This is what it looks like. That's what the box looks like when you flatten it out. So I just wanted you to see the whole thing. It says take 2 tablets every 8 hours. And that's called Advil dual action. How much does that cost? This is at Target. And this was the 36 count was $7.49. The 72 count was $11.29. The awkward thing about it is that you have to take both drugs. And that's always the problem we get into with the combinations, that what if you really don't need to take both drugs? You've bought the bottle. Now, having said that, what's the downside of taking 1 or 2 of those up to 3 times a day? It's a by definition, a relatively non-toxic dosage level because it's over the counter. And remember, those doses are always lower than the maximum doses prescribed. I mentioned this compendium article to you, and I mentioned that I was going to show you one of those figures from that compendium article, and there it is. And it does just talk about non-steroidals on the left-hand side here. So if non-steroidals can be tolerated, if non-steroidals are contraindicated, I would say right here, here's where you add in. You see how this works? Here's where you add in your acetaminophen, but I would say that for severe pain, the authors here only go up to 650. And if you're really trying to reduce the exposure to opiates, you can go up to 1,000, assuming there aren't any of those hepatic concerns. So that's the only comment that I would have about this. Schedule those doses. Don't let pain return. Once it returns, the patient gets anxious. That lowers pain threshold. Now you've got a whole problem to deal with there. And a lot of anxiety is produced by return of pain. And I'm going to address the anxiety issue here in just a minute with something that's not habituating. Non-steroidals are contraindicated. You talk about going up with the hydrocodone. You will notice here that these authors did not talk at all about tramadol. But tramadol is an option if you've got a patient on oral anticoagulants, but do not assume that there is no habituation or addiction liability, because there is. So this is from that same compendium, just October 2020 compendium. And there's your ibuprofen. I just wanted to show you, I mentioned tramadol, acetaminophen. There it is. So that probably is something that you can consider that would be more effective than just acetaminophen alone. So keep that one in mind for your oral anticoagulant patients or your patients who have gut ulceration histories. You can go ahead and use the tramadol acetaminophen combination. Another issue with using nonsteroidals is patients who are on low dose aspirin. However, remember that both these drugs, the nonsteroidal and the aspirin, bind to platelet membranes, but once the aspirin hits that platelet, it's irreversibly bound to the platelet membrane by acetylation. So if you take aspirin first and the aspirin gets to the platelet first, then you still have cardioprotection. If you take the nonsteroidal first, then all these new platelets get exposed to the nonsteroidal and the aspirin won't work. Having said that, it might be kind of a moot point, because I bet you've had your patients tell you, and you've probably read this, the effect of aspirin on cardiovascular events and bleeding and in the Healthy Elderly, New England Journal of Medicine, September of 2018, kind of changed everything in cardioprotection, the views about cardioprotection in large numbers of people. You will still see subsets taking low-dose aspirin, but not nearly as widespread, because the conclusions here were the use of low-dose aspirin as a primary prevention strategy in older adults resulted in a significantly higher risk of major hemorrhage and did not result in a significantly lower risk of cardiovascular disease when compared to placebo. So that did change our outlook on that a bit. So the ideal NSAID then would give us the inducible COX-2 isoform inhibition, maintain analgesic and anti-inflammatory effect with decreased adverse effects by preserving the integrity of the GI tract and renal plasma flow. There's only one COX-2 selective, but it really doesn't help with anything renal. So the COX-2 selective gives you no renal toxicity advantage, and that is different than what people thought when it first came out. So remember that Celebrex is no better for your kidneys than taking ibuprofen or naproxen sodium. However, Celebrex or celecoxib now is better from a standpoint of gastrointestinal ulceration and erosion. Other clinical applications could be things like nonsteroidals versus opioids, general prescribing guidelines. Remember that if a patient is already on a nonsteroidal, you know the one they're mostly on now is meloxicam. And I know you've seen it. Brand name is Mobic. It sounds like a farm herbicide. M-O-B-I-C. Sounds like those commercials you see in February, you know, when you're watching basketball on TV. You can tell I grew up on a farm. So NSAID failure, switch chemical categories, or switch to a drug unknown to the patient and prescription only. And examples of those would be these two. So unknown to the patient, prescription only. Remember, ibuprofen and naproxen sodium get no respect, therefore you get no placebo response, and the placebo response to analgesia is up to 30% efficacy. We get none of that with ibuprofen and naproxen sodium, and we still get great efficacy. That shows you how good they really are. But if you have a patient who sits down in the chair and says, don't tell me to use that Advil or that ibuprofen, that stuff's like water. Okay, well, let's reframe this. Say, you know, I've got a drug for you that we've had very good response with that's not ibuprofen and it's not Aleve. And it's not an opiate, but it gives you fast onset pain relief. Now be careful with, for example, ketorolac tablets. Remember, ketorolac tablets can only be used for a total of 5 days. Ketorolac is highly COX-1 selective, and ketorolac can cause a lot of problems for GI and renal disease patients. So you would never use ketorolac in the elderly or anyone with GI or renal pre-existing disease. And you probably have found that it's difficult to prescribe. I speak at a lot of endo meetings, and the endodontists like to use it. Gives you high peak pain relief, quick onset. Patient doesn't recognize it, so gives it more respect, and you get some placebo. But I will tell you that the pharmacist might call and say, did you give an injection of this first? And you're thinking, why are you asking me this? It's because the labeling of ketorolac stipulates that you only can give tablets as a follow-up to the injection, which on its face makes no sense, except that it makes sense if you want to reduce the prescribing of the tablets, which is exactly the purpose of that kind of labeling. Ketorolac is given in ERs all the time. So you're very likely to get ketorolac 30 or 60 milligrams intramuscular or IV for acute pain in the emergency room. And this is the table from that compendium article, very similar to what I showed you. But again, they only go up to 650 as well because it's shared authors there. So that's my only difference. I'm going to post this as a separate handout for you. And this is going to be what to do when, because I know that as busy clinicians, you encounter all these disease states on the left-hand side. And you have to know what to do about the NSAID decision. So there it is. And I've got the liver impairment categories. Notice this one, severe liver impairment, you are not going to give nonsteroidals. And I wanted to point that out. And then the other version of this is the acetaminophen version. And I'll give you a one-pager that's got both nonsteroidal and and acetaminophen on there with all these disease states. Notice again, look at liver impairment with the acetaminophen. Short-term use in mild liver impairment safe. And look at this, even in severe liver impairment, treatment of choice, maximum 1 gram per day. So you just have to know what the guidelines are, and that's from the hepatologist. So I want you to see that. If you think you cannot use it at all, I think most patients with severe liver impairment have probably been told not to take Tylenol. So that's going to eliminate not only acetaminophen, but nonsteroidals. And certainly then you would use much reduced doses of opiates. The adverse effects of nonsteroidals, I think you're very familiar with, and I don't have to belabor those. And this is how you minimize NSAID-induced dyspepsia. The main thing is 8 ounces of water, stay upright for 20 minutes. If you'll just do that, you won't get the worsening heartburn. Typically, you'll tolerate these drugs just fine. I do want to warn you that nonsteroidals in all of us reduce renal blood flow. It's just that some of us, the renal blood flow is so good that it doesn't matter. And that would be all you young people out there. My nephrons are getting old. They've been insulted many, many times by nonsteroidals, frequently, chronically. So remember that I talked about your COX-1 selective drug being ketorolac and your COX-2 selective being celecoxib, but typically our most balanced drugs, the drugs that are somewhere in here, are the safest. The ones on the far reaches tend to unbalance that arachidonic acid cascade. So here we have the rules for the elderly. And if a patient, I don't care who it is, it doesn't have to be anybody old, or I don't know what elderly is these days anyway. I think it's how many chronic disease states you have and your attitude. There's a lot of that. ACE inhibitor or ARB and a diuretic concomitantly predisposes to acute renal failure. So here you have the definition of stage 1, 2, 3A, 3B, and 4. And then this is, of course, stage 5, and that's failure on dialysis. This may be dialysis as well, depending. Remember, if a patient is on an ACE or an ARB and a diuretic, and you then add in a nonsteroidal, that's the triple whammy. And I'll post that analgesic interaction chart for you as well. So the key points with NSAIDs are here. I've talked about all of them. In the interest of time, I won't say them again. Well, we've talked about everything except we haven't talked about corticosteroids. And remember, corticosteroids can be used very, very short term for inflammatory pain. Post-root canal therapy for the patient who presents in pain, that's the patient likely to have root canal therapy post-procedural pain. And there are certain patients for whom even short-term corticosteroids may be too dangerous. I'm not a fan of the Medrol dose pack. I know it's easy, but it does tell a patient that they should take a corticosteroid at bedtime for 5 nights, and that's 5 nights that you don't sleep. So here's an example prescription of a single or 2 tablets this morning, then 1 or 2 tablets the following morning, depending on how aggressive you want to be. So I made it for 4 tablets to accommodate 2 tablets on day 1. And this would be a typical endodontic post-root canal therapy inflammatory pain case. Then take 1 tablet the following day and then you're done. This is self-tapering, 36-hour tissue half-life. There you have your relative contraindications. I wanted it all in one slide for you. So it's not for everybody. So I think we've talked about this enough. Don't forget about the tramadol plus acetaminophen. I mentioned to you that there are forms online. This is from a group in Rhode Island. Here we go. Prevent Overdose RI, that's Rhode Island.org. And I liked it because you can customize it over here, or they have their recommended suggested regimen. And you could just fill in the customizable one for your patients over here. So if you want just sort of a form, that's a pretty nice one. And it gives you the combo and the times. So that's, or you could easily have a millennial make that for you on the computer. We've talked about tramadol already, and your handout gives you this, but remember your advantages are that it's not a Schedule II, it's a good rescue pain medicine for neuropathic pain. So there are your key points with tramadol. Don't forget, there is abuse liability with tramadol. It's becoming more and more of a concern in the UK. So I know that we're told that we have an opioid dependence problem in the United States. The dentists in the United States do, but I will tell you that tramadol is not without its abuse liability. We've talked about the opioids, and one thing I wanted to mention then in closing is the true allergy versus pseudo allergy. If the patient says that I can't take an opiate because I had a terrible reaction, I had an allergic reaction, ask what it was. Remember, pseudo allergy is histamine release, and so there'll be no urticaria, no angioedema, no airway involvement. Okay, those are the stipulations. What if a patient's a bad historian, a poor historian, uncommitted historian? Then you can't assume pseudoallergy. But a lot of these are pseudoallergy due to histamine release, and codeine does that. A lot of people say, oh, codeine makes me so sick. That's histamine release, and maybe morphine does too. Hydrocodone is less likely to, oxycodone is less likely yet, then hydromorphone, then fentanyl. So this is how you would mitigate your risk for pseudoallergy. You could just take some liquid Benadryl, 25 milligrams, a half an hour before you take your hydrocodone. And that way you've covered up your histamine receptors. And therefore, even though histamine is released, it has no place to bind. We talked about the leftovers and our regimens. We talked about 3-1-1, just to reiterate. Here's one thing that I want to say at the end here. If your patient is just upset, and a lot of these folks, you know, surgery is traumatic, you don't undergo surgery very often. Hydroxyzine might be a really good alternative for anxiety that has no abuse potential whatsoever. So your substance use disorder patients, increasingly you're seeing hydroxyzine, which you might know as Atarax. You're seeing hydroxyzine used for anxiety because it doesn't have a habituation liability. So here's an example. It also comes in a liquid. So post-surgical use is easy. It's cheap and it's very sedating. It will give you a dry mouth. It might cause a little tachycardia, usually not substantial. And I think you'd find that that might be a help for you instead of going to opiates just to help with sleep. You can use hydroxyzine instead. This book is great. It's still in its first edition, 2015. But remember, patient perception is reality with analgesics in dentistry. I've talked about all of this. There are these risk evaluation mitigation strategies that are issued by the CDC and the FDA. And this is, I'll post this for you too, so you have it. You should have gotten it in the mail. And it was blue. That's why I'm showing you what it looks like. Look what it says. And this is what you're supposed to tell patients or hand to a patient. If you're going to take opiates, you cannot take any of the things listed there. And I think that would be a surprise to a lot of folks who are asking for opiates. So that's called risk evaluation mitigation strategy for certain high-risk drug categories. Opioids are one of those. So I will post a few more things for you, poor Angela, but one of them is the drug interactions with analgesics handout for us to use in chairside. Another one is the REMS sheet, because I want you to have it. I know you got it. If you have a provider number, an NPI, then you got it in the mail, but sometimes the mail doesn't quite make it where it needs to go. Exparel has been a bit of a disappointment. It's I think in one study in 2019, regular bupivacaine looked to be comparable in terms of efficacy in reducing opioid dosages as the 72-hour bupivacaine, which is very, very expensive. And then don't forget about your dexamethasone. There's my summary. We're coming around to the home stretch here. We've got about 10 minutes left. We've talked about everything on there. I will tell you that there are a lot of sort of different things happening now. This is a company that makes a post-oral surgery recovery kit. Stella Life is the company. And again, it's just kind of interesting. It gives patients things that they can proactively do in addition to taking ibuprofen and acetaminophen that may help them to feel as if they have more control, and they're very soothing, aloe in the gel, and so it's very soothing, and some practices are incorporating things like that. Where do we go from here? We have to be able to discuss safety issues and prescribe alternatives like dexamethasone or hydroxyzine. And in the future, and who knows when this is going to be something that happens, but we might be able to figure out who's going to be a responder and who isn't, because right now it's highly variable. And that was in this article in a journal that I'm sure is on your bedside stand right now, prostaglandins and other lipid mediators. I know it's there. And that just talks about all the different factors in the kinetics, the dynamics, and to produce analgesia. Very interesting. And it was talked about by Drs. Hirsch and Moore in that article that was just published in Journal of Dental Research 2020. And I can't give you any reprints because I don't have copyright permission. So remember, opioid sparing analgesia is our goal. And one of my fellow faculty here said his son was in the CVS, and he just sent this yesterday. It was so great. He said, look what I saw. I wanted to take a picture of it so you could give it to Karen. So there it is. This was in the CVS in Indianapolis, Indiana. And this even tells patients what you've been telling them. So the word is out. And I think that we're making a lot of headway. So that's the good news. I'll turn it over to Ted for questions. Thank you.
Well, Karen, you've covered a lot of ground today, and we have a few questions from the audience. So
Okay.
One of our hygienists asked, what is your main recommendation for pain control for a patient that has only one kidney?
That's a really good question. One kidney, the first question is that kidney functioning normally, or is that kidney also involved in terms of polycystic kidney disease or the like? So let's assume that it's normal function. We would consider that patient to have mild to moderate renal impairment. And so you would obviously start with acetaminophen in that patient. And I do have some details that I'm going to post on that in that chart that I showed you, what to do when. So that chart's going to address that. And the other thing you can do is use low dose extended interval ibuprofen. And always use a short half-life non-steroidal if you're going to use one in a patient with any sort of renal involvement. And one thing I failed to mention, I was talking about the elderly. Again, chronologically, your nephrons get old. And as they get old, you tend to develop cysts in your kidneys, it's very common, and you tend to lose parenchymal cells and nephron and lose renal blood flow. So just assume that anybody who's 95 years old in your chair or 90 years old in your chair is in renal failure. And they're not going to tell you they are because they probably ride bikes and build houses for Habitat for Humanity, but they still are in renal failure, some degree, because they're so chronologically old versus spiritually.
Question is, I've seen many MDs prescribing Tylenol 3 as needed, 1 tablet prior to going to bed. Is this a good regimen?
Tylenol number 3 is such a bad, ineffective drug that in our clinics here, and that's with my influence and Dr. Merrick's influence, it's been largely abandoned. It's constipating, nauseating, and it is sedating. So if you want 1 out of 3 of those, but you're going to wake up in a bad mood because of maybe the other 2. So it's just, I mean, you can look for yourself and decide what you want to do, but codeine does give you some sedation, but at a pretty high adverse effect price.
Next question is, can NSAIDs be prescribed in 400 or 800 milligram dosage forms to patients who are already on CBD oil for non-dental use?
CBD oil, to my knowledge, does not interact with nonsteroidals. So I think you're good to go there. And so many patients will tell you that they either apply it topically or take it by mouth or put drops under their tongue, all kinds of things. So I don't see any interaction there.
Does oxycodone break down to hydrocodone?
We think about the metabolic pathway. I believe it does. Whoever asked that, just email me and I'll send you the I've got this big, I thought it would just be too much. I've got this big metabolic pathway chart that shows you what the various drugs break down to. It seems to me that that is, and it's got all the opioids on there. So I'll send that to you if you email me. Also, some other people have emailed me about questions. Just go ahead and email me anything. It doesn't have to be related to this topic today. I got a question about antibiotics that I have to answer as soon as we're done.
Would you agree that pre-medicating with pain mediation prior to a dental procedure will minimize the total amount of pain mediation that is needed eventually?
I do agree with that. The downside is that you're giving 400 milligrams of ibuprofen, which is typically what we'd give, to someone who's been nothing by mouth, NPO, for 8 to 12 hours. And it may cause some irritation, but I think that's usually a small price to pay because you let them take it with a sip of water. And that's why I said keep the Advil minis, because if you want to give 2 of those, that's probably the least irritating, fastest onset way to go. And it's about 18 minutes onset.
How many milligrams of tramadol with acetaminophen for patients on new anticoagulants?
I gave you, that's a good question. So I gave you the chart, and it'll show you tramadol and how tramadol compares to maybe the drugs that we all use on a regular basis. 75 milligrams of tramadol is equivalent to 7.5 of hydrocodone. So if you're thinking you normally give 5 of hydrocodone, then give 50 of tramadol. So that's about roughly the comparable. So 50 of tramadol and probably 500 of acetaminophen. Remember, acetaminophen can affect warfarin. It probably doesn't affect the Xarelto or Eliquis or Saveza. Those are the other new ones. But if they're on warfarin, almost everything interacts with warfarin. But if they're on Xarelto or Eliquis, and that's typical, like for AFib, let's say, then you can use up to the higher doses of acetaminophen without problems. But 50 milligrams of tramadol, it comes in 50 milligram tabs. Maximum dose is 400 milligrams per 24 hours.
With regard to oral anticoagulants, are you lumping them all together, warfarin versus Eliquis?
No. I think when I just answered that question, I separate out warfarin, because warfarin is problematic even with acetaminophen because there's so many mechanisms by which warfarin interacts with drugs. The direct oral anticoagulants, which is Pradaxa, Xarelto, and Eliquis, do not appear to interact adversely with acetaminophen.
Has Etodolac been removed from the market in the United States?
You know, Etodolac rhymes with Ed Podolak, I always say. Etodolac, sorry, that's the only way my students
I
get.
remember Ed. So.
Okay, yeah, he's 73, 74 years old now. So Etodolac is still on the market to my knowledge because we use it. So I think that it might not be stocked at every pharmacy. I think that might be the issue. Also, I don't want to misspeak because there's so much supply chain disruption right now with COVID. But it's not been removed by any sort of FDA action.
Within the spectrum of pain control regimens presented, please provide pros and cons for the use of naproxen sodium for dental pain control.
The biggest pro of naproxen sodium is a much longer half-life. I've got the half-lives of all the analgesic nonsteroidals in your handout for you. And what you can see is that the half-life of naproxen and naproxen sodium, the parent drug, is 12 to 13 hours versus the half-life of ibuprofen, which is about 2 hours. So what you can do is you can sleep for longer. You don't wake up at 4 hours and say, wow, this throbbing pain is coming back. So one way to handle the naproxen sodium is to take it every 8 hours, allowing for 8 hours of uninterrupted rest. And you could take your naproxen sodium dose, whatever that dose is, whether it's 275 or 550, with 1,000 of Tylenol every 8 hours. So the huge advantage there is longer duration.
Is severe asthma an absolute contraindicator for ibuprofen?
Severe asthma is not an absolute contraindication. There's something called Samter's triad that would be a pretty good indication that the patient can't tolerate prostaglandin inhibitors. Samter's triad, you might have heard of, called the aspirin sensitivity triad. That means the patient not only has asthma, but they have intermittent urticaria and nasal polyps. Now, most of those patients have already been told by their physician that they can only take Tylenol for headaches and temperatures. They can only take Tylenol. But so you ask them a couple questions. Say, have you ever been told not to take anything but Tylenol for any reason? Have you ever taken ibuprofen? And if so, were you okay from an asthma standpoint? So those are the questions that you ask. If you look up Samter's triad, you'll see sort of an explosion of information. It's also called NERD, which is easier to remember, non-steroidal exacerbated respiratory disease. And about a 30% risk of non-steroidal exacerbated respiratory disease in patients who display Samter's triad.
All right, the last question is, Toradol was first marketed as an oral medication, then became an IV-IM drug. What changed, and can we still prescribe it as an oral only?
Toradol is really effective and was marketed first by Roche as a tablet, and it was limited to 7 days of chronic use, which was routinely disregarded by physicians. And what happened was people perforated gastric ulcers and went on renal dialysis. And the FDA said, wait a minute, this should be off the market. And then in negotiations with the company said, if we can limit tablet use, can we keep it on the market? And I think both of them, and I don't quote me on this, but I think the injectable and the tablets were roughly marketed around the same time, maybe injection a little bit after. But so the way that this works is that the deal that was struck was that the tablets were allowed to continue, but only in a very narrow indication pathway. Now, can you prescribe outside of labeled indications? Sure you can. It's called off-label use. We do that with a lot of things. Physicians do it all the time. So if you're going to prescribe tablets without the injection first, what you write on the prescription is off-label use underneath the SIG. Then the pharmacist won't have to call you and ask you if you gave an injection first.
Well, on behalf of all the assembled members of CDS and their hygiene counterparts, I want to thank you for a very informative day. The CE sheets will be emailed to all the attendees in the next few days, and I'm sure Karen will be sending all that information for my assistant Angela to post on the CDS website. If there are questions, you can contact me at tboris@cds.org, and we will do our best to answer them. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Ted, and thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day.